In the luxurious room, every eye was fixed on Naomi Ellis like a lost prey. Gregory Hale curled his lips with venom. Letting her sit here just dirties the chair. Officer Kane slowly stood up, his voice ice cold. "You're in the wrong place, girl." Naomi lifted her head, her gaze cold as steel. "I'm sitting exactly where he wanted me to." Attorney Whitman closed the file, his voice firm. The sole heir to the entire estate, Naomi Ellis. The whole room fell silent. Those who once mocked her were swallowed by a terrifying void. If you want to see what she went through, then stay until the end. Naomi Ellis paused in front of the large wooden door inlaid with intricate patterns, her hand slightly trembling as it touched the cold handle. Laughter echoed from inside, crystal glasses clinked, and chairs scraped across the marble floor. The atmosphere was foreign, dazzling in its extravagance, yet suffocating to someone always treated as an outsider like her. When the door opened, golden light from the crystal chandeliers spilled out, swallowing Naomi's hesitation. Every face turned toward her, eyes sharp and judging, as if her presence was a stain on the room so meticulously adorned. Naomi took a deep breath, trying to steady her steps. The row of red velvet-covered chairs was already packed with relatives of the Monroe family, all draped in an air of privilege and arrogance. The murmurs faded into open sneers. An elderly aunt raised an eyebrow, scanned Naomi from head to toe, her wrinkled face curling into a vicious smile as she muttered bitterly, "How did they let that black girl in? It's disgraceful." Her voice was loud enough for the whole row to hear, drawing a few quiet but mocking chuckles. Naomi paused briefly, then kept walking, her shoulders slightly shaking. She caught the scornful gaze of Officer Kane, a man in police uniform not here to keep order, but clearly acting as a bodyguard for the wealthy. He smirked, leaning against a chair, his joking tone sharp like a blade. "Let her sit. I guarantee she won't make a peep." Laughter broke out in agreement, blending with the clinking of wine glasses, as if his comment was entertainment for this powerful gathering. Naomi tightened her grip on the small bag in her hand, her nails digging into the soft leather. She didn't respond, quietly finding an empty seat in the far corner. The luxurious room suddenly felt like a furnace, every stare aimed at her like it could burn through skin. She lowered her head slightly, hiding the anger boiling in her chest. A quiet sigh escaped, and in that moment, she whispered to herself, "I have to endure this to the end." At the front, a long table covered in white cloth was set with wine glasses, stacks of documents, and a neatly placed microphone. Attorney Whitman was preparing papers to begin the reading of the will. He glanced briefly at Naomi, a flicker of reassurance in his eyes, before returning to his composed, professional demeanor. Naomi caught that look, and it gave her a faint sliver of hope in a sea of hostility. Gregory Hale, the family's eldest grandson, had been lounging back in his seat, his arrogant smile widening at the sight of Naomi. He tilted his head slightly, exchanging glances with Officer Doyle, the accomplice standing guard near the door. Naomi knew those looks weren't just disdain, they were threats. Every step she took felt like walking on shattered glass, each laugh, each whisper cutting deeper into her resolve. The room gradually sank into an artificial silence, but beneath that surface simmered toxic undercurrents. Naomi could feel clearly that she wasn't welcome. No one wanted her there, and her presence made the entire space uneasy. Still, she kept her back straight, eyes fixed on the table where the lawyer was preparing to begin. Though fear and outrage swirled inside her, Naomi knew she couldn't walk away. This was where Edward Monroe wanted her to be, and she wouldn't betray that final trust. The wait dragged on endlessly, each tap of the lawyer's pen against the wooden table pounding like the heavy beat of fate. Naomi took another deep breath, building herself a wall of strength in the middle of this storm of scorn. She understood that even the smallest misstep would give these people the satisfaction of tearing apart her already fragile presence. But she also knew that at the end of this humiliating path, the truth would come to light. That certainty was what held her inside this suffocating room. Every shift in a chair, every cleared throat around her felt like a warning shot, subtle reminders that she didn't belong. The way they avoided her gaze, or worse, stared as if she were an intruder, made the air even harder to breathe. Naomi sat perfectly still, determined not to give them a single reaction, not even a blink too long. She could sense the hunger in the room, the craving to see her break, but she wouldn't break. Not here, not in front of them. She had come too far, carrying too many wounds already, to let their contempt cut any deeper. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was survival, and behind it burned a quiet defiance they couldn't reach. Somewhere in that stillness, Naomi felt a shift, not in them, but in herself, a sharpening of resolve. No matter what came next, she would endure it, because this moment, as unbearable as it was only the beginning of something greater. The atmosphere in the lavish room had already been tense since Naomi stepped in, but it grew heavier when Gregory Hale suddenly burst into loud laughter. The sound echoed, drawing the attention of everyone seated around the long table. He leaned on the back of his chair, his voice dripping with arrogance, as if offering entertainment to the crowd. She probably thinks she'll get a little patch of land to pitch a tent on. As soon as the words left his mouth, a wave of laughter broke out. Soft chuckles and approving nods spreading like a disease, turning Naomi into the crowd's shared amusement. Naomi sat upright, her eyes flickering for a moment. She knew every word from Gregory's mouth was a blade aimed directly at her pride. The jeers didn't stop. A few guests lowered their heads to whisper, but loud enough for Naomi to hear. Such a shame for him. We thought he'd leave it to someone worthy, but he let this girl sit here instead. What was she thinking, walking into a place like this? The room became a stage, and she, the unwilling act, dragged out for laughs. From the back of the room, Officer Doyle walked forward and carelessly slammed a thick notebook down in front of Naomi. The heavy thud of the papers on the wooden table echoed through the space, deliberate and humiliating. He leaned down, flashing a cold smile, and spoke each word with cruel clarity. Take notes fast. At least it's good training for housekeeping. The air, already thick, now cracked under the weight of his disdain. Doyle didn't bother hiding his mockery. His eyes lit up with satisfaction as he saw Naomi freeze for a moment. Naomi clenched her hands, cold sweat slicking her palm. Her body trembled, but from somewhere deep inside, a force surged upward, refusing to let her stay silent. Her voice came out weak at first, but carried unexpected weight. I'm here because I have the right. The words rang loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. For a second, a few faces froze, but then the wave of ridicule returned, louder and more vicious, drowning out everything else. Laughter erupted, layered and chaotic, like a symphony of mockery played in unison. An older aunt tapped her wineglass against the table and burst out laughing. Oh, did you hear her? She thinks she has rights. How pathetic. Gregory leaned in, his eyes flashing with delight at Naomi's attempt to respond. Where do you think your rights come from? That low-born name of yours? His words cut like another knife to Naomi's chest. Attorney Whitman had tapped his pen on the table several times, signaling for order. But the laughter, the taunts, and the cruelty drowned out all efforts. Please, everyone, let's proceed as planned, he called out. But no one listened. Their pleasure now came entirely from watching Naomi suffer. Naomi tried to steady her breathing, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She raised her head, eyes fixed on the table where the lawyer sat, searching for the only anchor she had. In that gaze was fragility, but also a faint flame that refused to die out. She knew that if she left her seat, if she stayed silent, they would all take it as proof she didn't belong here. But she also understood that Edward Monroe, the man who had left this world behind, wanted her to be here. And because of that, no matter how cruel the laughter became, she couldn't allow herself to bow her head. The laughter dragged on endlessly, glasses clinking not to celebrate, but to add noise, drowning out every effort Naomi made to stay grounded. Some leaned toward each other, laughing with delight as if watching a scene that perfectly fit their taste for cruelty. But Naomi remained still, hands clasped tightly, eyes sharpening like blades even as her body continued to tremble. She knew the real battle had just begun, and her endurance would need to stretch far beyond this moment before the truth could finally surface. In that instant, the room felt like a brutal stage. On one side stood the many, armed with arrogance, power, and mockery. On the other side sat Naomi, alone, small, but carrying within her a will that refused to be crushed. The taunts had begun, the first notes of a long and bitter performance. Yet Naomi also understood that every word thrown at her became evidence. Every laugh etched deeper into the truth of who these self-proclaimed judges really were. The room once again sank into a swirl of chaotic laughter, the tapping of shoes on the floor, and venomous remarks. Attorney Whitman closed his eyes briefly, knowing this contempt wouldn't last forever. He was preparing to read the words that would silence the entire room. But in that moment, all Naomi could focus on was staying upright, absorbing every blow, waiting for the reversal no one saw coming. To Naomi, this was a moment of public humiliation, but it was also the first step on the road toward the truth, a path that would turn cruel laughter into stunned silence, and that only time would prove. The mocking laughter still hummed through the lavish room when a shrill female voice cut through the noise, sharp and high-pitched, pulling the crowd into silence. She was one of the oldest members of the family, hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes cold and piercing as they locked onto Naomi. She made no attempt to hide her contempt, her words hissing through clenched teeth. Her mother was a maid. Low blood stays low forever. The whispers that followed spread like fire fed with oil. Some nodded in agreement, others chuckled with cruel delight. Naomi sat frozen, her body paralyzed by the weight of that sentence. Her heart clenched as the image of her mother appeared clearly in her mind. Rough hand, worn clothes, and eyes that always carried hope. Her mother had endured every sneer, every insult, but never once bowed to injustice. Now Naomi was the one standing in that storm, facing the same humiliation in a room where everyone treated her as nothing more than an intruder. Across the table, Gregory Hale's smirk deepened as he watched Naomi stay silent. He lifted his wine glass slowly, turned it in his hand, then suddenly slammed it to the floor. The sharp crash of shattered glass startled the room, followed by a round of amused laughter. Gregory stood, stepping forward with a firm voice. Are we really supposed to sit with her? Ridiculous. His words drew a few light claps and murmurs of agreement. He carried himself like a man performing on stage, feeding off the audience's cruel approval. Officer Kane, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, glanced at Gregory, then stepped toward Naomi. The chandelier's light caught the badge on his chest, giving it an ominous glint. Kane bent down, bringing his face close to hers, the smell of cigarettes on his breath. His voice was low but loud enough for others to hear. People like you are born to serve. The sentence struck like a hammer, smashing through the last defenses inside Naomi's mind. For a moment, Naomi's eyes turned red, her breath quickened, and her chest rose and fell with restrained fury. Every laugh, every insult, every sneer about her blood and background pressed down like a stone on her heart. But from deep within, the memory of her mother rose like a flame. She had once said, "You can be poor, you can be looked down on, but never let anyone take your dignity." Naomi tightened her fists, lifted her head, and swept her gaze across every face waiting to see her break. Her voice trembled, yet struck hard, each word like a blade. "My dignity is not yours to take." The room fell silent for a beat. A few people frowned, not out of admiration, but surprise that such strength could come from someone so small. Gregory laughed again, loud and harsh. "Listen to her, like she belongs here." Another voice chimed in. "That kind of pride, what's it even worth?" But Naomi didn't look away. She stayed exactly where she was, head held high, unmoved. Attorney Whitman placed his pen on the table once more, the dry tapping sound ringing out like a warning. He looked around the room, his voice calm but firm. "Please maintain order. We are here to hear a final wish. Let us all remember, this is not a court of mockery." But his words were drowned out by stifled giggles and mocking glances. Naomi felt like she was caught between two flames. One was the searing heat of humiliation, the other, a rising blaze of willpower, urging her to stay strong. She knew that if she crumbled now, it would confirm every insult thrown at her. But with just that one sentence, by simply not backing down, she had held on to the most important thing she had left, her dignity. The air grew thicker, heavy with the sting of venomous words. All eyes remained fixed on Naomi. Some waited for her to break. Others were curious to see if she would fight back again. Amid the chaos, Naomi sat still, eyes dry, her chest still trembling from the emotion. But beneath it all, a new depth of resolve had taken hold. Gregory returned to his seat, leaned back, picked up another glass of wine from a passing tray and lifted it, as if the performance was far from over and had only just begun. Naomi didn't look away, didn't try to hide. Her heart had chosen a path, to endure it all until the moment the truth would silence the laughter still echoing around her. In that moment, even surrounded by humiliation, Naomi understood that the attacks on her background had become a measure of their cruelty and emptiness. The more they tried to degrade her, the more they exposed their own weakness. And that, she knew, would be the price they paid when the will was finally read aloud, a truth they would not be able to deny. The air in the room, already thick with laughter and insults, suddenly erupted when Gregory Hale sprang to his feet. The heavy wooden chair toppled backward and slammed onto the floor with a sharp thud that startled several people. His face flushed red, his eyes wild, and his finger trembled with fury as he pointed straight at Naomi. His voice thundered through the room like a blow. "Get her out of here. This is a family meeting." The words weren't just a command, they were a public rejection, a declaration that Naomi's presence meant nothing in a room full of people who believed they alone held claim to the legacy. The murmurs ignited like dry leaves in flame. Several guests nodded eagerly, banging their hands on the table in support. As the tension surged, Officer Doyle stepped forward, a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. He rolled up his sleeves with deliberate aggression and slammed his wide palm onto the table. the sound sharp and threatening. His voice dripped with challenge. "Just say the word and I'll drag her out myself." His threat drew laughter from a few nearby, the kind of laughter that imagined Naomi being hauled away as perfect entertainment. Naomi clenched her hands tight on her lap, feeling the weight of stone across her shoulders. The entire room had turned into a solid wall of hostility pressing her toward the edge. But in that moment, she suddenly lifted her head, her eyes steely and no longer avoiding contact. She looked straight at Gregory, then at Doyle, then swept across the faces, grinning at her downfall. Her voice rang out, surprisingly firm even to herself. "He asked me to stay. None of you has the right to send me away." Each word landed heavy and clear, like arrows piercing through the wall of arrogance they had built around themselves. A brief silence hung over the room, but it lasted only a few breaths before anger erupted again. Gregory roared, slamming his hand on the table so hard the wine glasses and silverware rattled. The sound boomed like thunder, shaking the room. Chairs screeched across the marble floor. A few people stood and shouted in agreement, turning the scene into a twisted courtroom, with Naomi as the accused and the crowd as a hostile jury. The air was thick with hatred, so heavy it felt like it could be carved with a knife. Naomi could feel the seething fury of the entire room bearing down on her. But strangely, in the heart of that chaos, she found something else. An unfamiliar strength. Her heart pounded, not from fear anymore, but from a growing certainty she would not back down. Attorney Whitman, seated at the head of the table, watched the scene with growing concern. He was no stranger to tense will reading, but never before had he witnessed such open and vicious hostility. He struck his pen hard against the table, his voice sharp and commanding. "Everyone, please maintain order. This is the final will of Edward Monroe. None of us has the right to change it." But his words seemed to vanish into thin air, overwhelmed by Gregory's fury and Doyle's gloating satisfaction. Naomi remained still, her eyes stinging, but her breath steady. The barrage of insults, the open threats, even Doyle's readiness to use force, couldn't shake her from her seat. Every time a glare cut into her like a blade, Naomi recalled the warm, steady voice of Edward, the man who once called her to his side and said, "You are worth more than what they want you to believe." Chairs rattled, wine sloshed, shouts echoed, and filled the air with seething rage. Yet Naomi stayed where she was, her tear-filled eyes glowing with defiance. Her words lingered in the minds of those around her, challenging the contempt that had once seemed strong enough to crush a young woman with ease. No one had expected that in this grand room, stacked with power and wealth, someone would dare to fight back with nothing more than a sharp, steady sentence. Gregory's rage hit its peak. He slammed the table again, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. "You'll regret ever sitting here." Doyle chuckled, his eyes gleaming with cruelty, as if waiting for the signal to act. But Naomi didn't flinch. She knew that every word she spoke was a declaration of presence. And as long as she stayed in that room, as long as she held her head high, it was they, not her, who trembled at the truth about to be revealed. In the middle of that hostile scene, Naomi became the center of attention, not because of weakness, but because of the quiet strength in her refusal to leave her seat. And that alone, more than any argument or defense, shook the arrogant foundation Gregory and his allies had built throughout the evening. The banging and shouting from earlier had barely settled when another shrill voice cut through the air like a blade, slicing into the already tense atmosphere. It came from one of Gregory's maternal relatives, a thin woman with a face twisted in fury. She shrieked, her pitch so sharp it felt like it could pierce Naomi's chest. "You came here to beg for an inheritance?" Dream on her words echoed through the elegant room, triggering laughter from several guests, their eyes locking onto Naomi as if the question alone confirmed she was there to scavenge. Naomi lowered her head briefly, fingers tightening around the edge of her chair, her chest swelling with both anger and shame. That question unearthed memories of all the times she and her mother had been looked down on, pitied, or outright scorned. But worse than the insult was the way the crowd laughed in unison, handing out judgment without needing any proof. Gregory Hale dropped into his chair with a smug grin and leaned forward, raising his wineglass as if delivering a speech to an audience. Maybe she's hoping to walk away with a few loose bills. The room erupted in laughter, the clinking of glasses rising with it, forming a brutal symphony of mockery. Gregory tilted his head back and drank in one gulp, pride written all over his face, as if he had found the perfect way to crush the last of Naomi's courage. Officer Kane, standing nearby, seized the moment. He chuckled dryly and shook his head, his eyes dragging over Naomi from head to toe, full of contempt. His words came out cutting and sour. That cheap dress says it all." The line dropped with cruel precision, and laughter rang out again. A few women exchanged glances, nodding in agreement, as if the fabric Naomi wore was all they needed to decide who she was and what she deserved. Naomi felt the blood rush to her face, her eyes burning, her nose stinging. The insults hit like sharp daggers, relentless and cruel. But in the middle of that storm of ridicule, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reaching for another memory. Edward Monroe, the man who once placed a warm hand on her shoulder, who had called her granddaughter, whose gaze had never held a trace of scorn. That memory, small but steady, was what Naomi clung to, the anchor keeping her from sinking in a sea of hostility. She opened her eyes and looked ahead. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the noise like an arrow against the wind. "He used to call me his granddaughter." For one brief moment, the room fell silent, just long enough for her words to reach every ear. But then the laughter exploded again, louder than before. People doubled over, slapped the table, and roared with disbelief that a girl so long dismissed would dare to speak as if she were truly part of Edward's family. Gregory threw his head back and laughed loudly, cutting in to drown out Naomi's words. "Granddaughter, you have to share blood to be family. You're just a shadow on the outside. Don't kid yourself." Officer Doyle laughed aloud too, adding with a sneer, "If he really saw you as family, then maybe he'd already lost his mind." Their words twisted even Edward's final kindness into something pitiful, stripping it of any meaning and calling it weakness. Naomi went quiet for a few seconds, her eyes brimming but refusing to let a single tear fall. She knew if she cried now, they would feel victorious, convinced they had broken her. So she held her gaze steady, lips pressed tightly. What she had just said wasn't meant for them to believe. It was a reminder for herself that she once had a place in the heart of the only person here who truly saw her as family. Attorney Whitman struck his pen hard against the table again, his voice stern. "Enough. We are not here to argue. We are here to fulfill a final wish." But his words were buried under the hum of continued laughter, as those seated ignored the dignity he struggled to restore. Naomi remained seated, hands clasped tightly, eyes locked forward. Each insult felt like a lash, leaving behind a sting that pulsed beneath the surface. Yet from those wounds, something stronger was growing. She understood now that the more vicious the mockery, the heavier its weight would become once the truth was revealed. And so she held herself steady, at least on the outside, to face the storm that kept pouring down. The room had become a courtroom without fairness, where Naomi was judged not by law, but by prejudice, not by evidence, but by laughter and scorn. But within that cruelty, Naomi saw she was not entirely powerless. Because she knew something they didn't. The will held a truth they couldn't imagine. And when that truth came to light, every insult hurled today would reflect only their own shamelessness. Surrounded by their glee, Naomi stayed grounded, her heart trembling but her eyes unwavering. She knew she wasn't fighting for their approval, but for a memory, for the affection Edward had given her. And as long as she held on to that, she would never lose. The chaos in the room still echoed with laughter, curses, and angry pounding when, from the head of the table, Attorney Whitman struck his pen sharply against the wood. The dry, cracking sound echoed like a bell, halting the noise for a brief moment. He cleared his throat lightly, his thoughtful gaze sweeping across the faces burning with rage, then spoke with crisp authority. "Please maintain order. This is the final wish." His words were not a plea, but a command that blanketed the room, forcing silence, even if begrudging and tense. Naomi sat quietly in her seat at the back, hands tightly clasped, palms damp with sweat. She could still feel the eyes pressing down on her, but in that moment when the pen struck, it was as if she found a new breath of air. Whitman opened the thick folder in front of him, the sound of shuffling paper rustling beneath the brilliant chandelier light. The room fell into an eerie stillness, as though every person inside was holding their breath, waiting for the judgment held in those pages. Whitman's voice rang steady, each word deliberate. "The estate shall go to the one who deserves it, regardless of bloodline." The sentence landed with the force of thunder, freezing the room for a split second. Eyes darted across the table, some filled with confusion, others already bracing for outrage. The silence was shattered as Gregory Hale jumped to his feet, his chair tipping sideways, face flushed red, eyes blazing. He shouted, his voice raw with fury. "Who else would it be? It has to be me." His voice exploded through the room, startling a few, while most nodded in firm agreement, as if Gregory's assumption had just confirmed what everyone already believed. He slammed his hand down hard on the table, wine spilling and trailing across the wood like a streak of blood. Gregory raised his chin, chest puffed, his gaze challenging the lawyer to confirm what he demanded to be true. In the back, Naomi's heart pounded so hard it felt ready to burst. Whitman's statement had pulled every string inside her taut. Images came flooding in. Of years spent on the margin, of quiet evenings working with her mother in the worn-down kitchen, of the rare but kind words Edward Munro once gave her. She shut her eyes tightly, inhaling deeply, fighting to stay composed in a room soaked in hostility. Every heartbeat echoed like a war drum, announcing that something was fast approaching. The room turned into a quiet storm. Whitman's words stirred up old tensions, silent fears, and bitter greed. People began whispering among themselves. If blood doesn't count, then who else but Gregory? Another voice muttered. Who's he planning to give it to? That girl? The question sparked a wave of laughter, part disbelief, part cruel joy, but also planted a seed of doubt, and with that, many eyes slowly turned back toward Naomi. Gregory, seeing this, only seemed more emboldened. He pressed both hands against the table, leaning slightly forward, his voice harsh as he bit off each word. Everything he had is mine. I'm the firstborn grandson. I'm the only one who deserves it. No one else. He wasn't just speaking, he was shouting, trying to crush any other flicker of hope before it could spark. Naomi trembled slightly, her shoulders shaking, but she kept her eyes shut tight. In that dim, closed-off space, she could hear her own breathing, the sneering laughter around her, and the firm tapping of Whitman's pen. A thought echoed through her mind. They can laugh, they can deny it, but the truth can't stay buried. Her heart kept pounding, torn between fear and the anticipation of something about to be revealed. The tension in the room tightened with every second. The divide was clear on everyone's faces. Some still backed Gregory with smug grin. Others had begun to doubt. A few sat unusually quiet, as if something deep inside them already sensed the will wouldn't follow the path they expected. All eyes turned to Whitman, who held the file in his hand. His face showed no emotion, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that spoke of caution. Gregory circled the table, his leather shoes hitting the floor with heavy, deliberate thuds. He stopped directly in front of Naomi, leaned in, and spoke in a low, threatening tone. You hear me? It's all mine. You're just here for the show. Don't fool yourself. Naomi kept her eyes closed, but her fists clenched tighter, veins visible beneath her skin. She didn't respond, but inside, a voice rose up. Just wait, they'll see. The room grew suffocating, like a wire pulled so tight it could snap at any second. Whitman glanced around the room, then lowered his eyes to the pages in front of him. He knew the words he was about to read would change everything, turning Mockery into dead silence. But he also knew Naomi would have to endure a few more knives of ridicule before they got there. And somehow, her quiet resistance now gave that moment more meaning than ever before. Under the shimmering crystal lights, Naomi remained still, eyes shut, heart racing, waiting for the moment the truth would be spoken. The moment that would turn this elegant room into a place where the true faces of those who had shamed her would be exposed without mercy. The tension in the lavish room had barely begun to settle when Gregory Hale suddenly yanked the tablecloth in front of him and flung it to the floor. The sharp sound echoed through the room, releasing a wave of fury that swept across the space. He shouted, eyes blazing, face twisted with rage. Her being here stains the Monroe name. His voice rang against the walls like a sentence handed down, immediately met with nods, whispers, and derisive laughter, all aimed at Naomi, the quiet girl at the end of the row. An elderly woman with silver hair and a face contorted by anger shot to her feet and shrieked, "Get her out before she leaves a stain." Her voice was so piercing that it sent chills through some, but instead of protest, the room filled with agreement. Hands slammed against the table, and a few clapped in unison, turning the scream into a collective chant. In that moment, Naomi felt like the room had transformed into a twisted courtroom, where everyone was a judge and she, the condemned, on trial simply for existing. Officer Doyle stepped forward, his shoes pounding the marble floor like the beat of a war drum. He stood in front of Naomi, eyes sharp with hostility, his finger pointing directly at her, each word deliberate and cold. You hear that? No one wants you here. The sentence cut through the air like a blade, making the already suffocating room feel unbearable. Naomi could feel the heated breath of those around her, the hatred pressing against her like an invisible wall, forcing her deeper into the cold chair. Every sound swelled into a storm, shouting, mocking laughter, fists pounding, glasses clinking, wine spilling like red drops across the table. Naomi sat still, hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her skin, shoulders trembling under the weight. Her throat tightened, heart pounding, breath shallow. But in the middle of the storm, she heard the warm voice of Edward Munro rise from memory, the voice that once shielded and lifted her. You must stand tall, Naomi, because only when you raise your head will others bow theirs. A surge of strength rose inside her. Naomi lifted her head, eyes wet but steady. Her voice broke out, shaky at first, but growing firm. The truth will be revealed. The words weren't aimed at Doyle or Gregory alone, but at every stare leveled at her. They landed like a challenge, slicing through the poisoned air and giving Naomi a faint glimmer of light inside the storm. The room froze for a beat. Those who had just filled the air with noise went silent for a breath, as if stunned that a girl surrounded by so many enemies still had the courage to speak. But the anger returned, fiercer than before. Gregory let out a dry, bitter laugh. Truth? The truth is, you don't belong here. Another woman clapped sharply, her voice laced with venom. Shameless. Talking about truth when you're the stain on this family. Naomi remained still, her eyes fixed on Attorney Whitman, who held the file in his hand. He hadn't resumed reading, but his gaze swept briefly over Naomi, and in that moment, a flicker of sympathy and resolve flashed through his eyes. He knew that every insult hurled at her now would only make the next moment heavier, more resounding. Gregory wouldn't stop. He stepped forward, his shoes pounding against the tile in a rising rhythm. He leaned in close to Naomi, his voice low and threatening. Sit there and imagine all you want, but in a moment, everyone will see you're nothing. Naomi took a deep breath, willing herself not to tremble. The words she had spoken earlier, "The truth will be revealed," now felt like a vow, and she knew she couldn't take it back. The people in the room continued flinging jeers, each like a stone aimed straight at her. Who does this girl think she is? Her sitting here ruins the whole gathering. She'll leave in shame. Each sentence weighed heavily, but strangely, a quiet calm was rising within her. Because with every cruel word they spoke, Naomi became more certain that when the truth came out, it would turn all their scorn into a joke at their own expense. In this final storm of mockery, Naomi became the center not because of weakness, but because of the strength forged through every slash of contempt. She knew there was more to endure, more attacks ahead, but in this moment, she had planted something, a clear declaration that the truth would come. And under the crushing pressure of the entire room, that seed only sank deeper into her core. Attorney Whitman took a long breath, his hand resting on the next page. He could feel the air stretched so tight that a single word might snap it, and it was the laughter, the insults, the venom raining down on Naomi that fueled his resolve to read aloud the words that would change everything. In that grand, hostile room, bitterness was reaching its peak, but just one beat more, and the balance would shift. Naomi closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the ridicule fall like hail. But in her mind, she held on to one clear light, a silent promise to Edward that she would not give up. And in that instant, beneath the laughter and the cruelty, she realized she was no longer the powerless girl she once was. She had become the only person in that room capable of forcing them all to hear the truth. Attorney Whitman adjusted the silver-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, his hand slightly trembling, but his voice rang out sharp, clear, and piercing, each word cutting through the thick air in the room like a blade. He scanned the faces glaring back at him. Gregory's, flushed with fury, the suspicious stares of aunts and uncles seated in the front rows, then lowered his eyes to the page. His voice rang like a bell. The entire estate is to be left to Naomi Ellis. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. Every sound was sucked from the room, leaving only the faint shimmer of crystal chandeliers swaying above. Then came a collective gasp, one sharp breath shared by everyone, like a shockwave rippling through the space. A few wine glasses slipped from trembling hands and shattered on the marble floor, the harsh crack echoing like the shattering of pride. No one could believe what they'd just heard. Faces, once smug, twisted into disbelief, the golden glint of confidence now wide-eyed with panic and stunned silence. Gregory Hale looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He doubled over briefly, then shot upright, gripping the edge of the table, veins bulging across his neck. His voice came out shrill, furious, trembling with rage he couldn't contain. Lies. How can some outsider inherit? His scream was so loud it made some nearby flinch, the veins in his temples pulsing. He slammed his fist on the table, sending red wine spilling across the white tablecloth like a bloodstain. Naomi Ellis sat quietly, having endured every insult, every sneer, every blatant threat since the start of this gathering. Her heart had been pressed to the edge, but now, as the truth emerged, she slowly raised her head. Her eyes, once filled with restrained tears, now glowed, not with pride, but with a quiet certainty, the light of a trust fulfilled. Her voice rose, soft, firm, cutting through the murmurs. He chose me, whether you accept it or not. The voice stunned many, not for its volume, but for its steadiness. It carried no fear, no weakness, only strength and truth. One elderly aunt stood, trembling, her lips moving as if to object, but no words came. A middle-aged man hurled his wineglass to the ground, but his eyes avoided Naomi's, as though he'd just glimpsed a force greater than he could comprehend. Gregory was not done. He lunged forward, jabbing a finger at Naomi, his voice a wounded animal's cry. Impossible! Everything he had, everything he built, was supposed to be mine. I'm the rightful bloodline. You're nothing but trash that latched on. His words were vicious, but they rang louder as the desperate howl of someone being torn from the throne he believed would always be his. Officer Doyle stepped forward, his face tightening as he tried to summon whatever authority remained in his role as a police officer. His voice dropped, laced with bitterness. "This is a setup," she bribed the lawyer. "This can't be real," but his words were lost in the rising murmur of whispers, and the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes stripped them of any force. Attorney Whitman lifted his head, his expression as stern as stone. He raised the stack of papers in his hand, his voice firm and unwavering. "This will is signed, witnessed, and fully validated. No one, not even you, has the right to deny it." Each word he spoke landed like a hammer, silencing what weak protests remained. Naomi stayed in her seat, back straight, eyes glowing like a torch in the dark. Her words were few, but they halted every attempt to dispute the truth. It was her composure that spoke louder than any defense. The truth had already spoken for itself. That elegant room, once filled with cruel laughter at her expense, had now fallen into a chilling silence. The clinks of broken glass, footsteps crunching shards beneath them, the sharp inhale of breath. These sounds formed a requiem of collapse. And at the center stood Naomi, no longer mocked, but marked as the chosen one of Edward Monroe. Gregory kept screaming, his voice hoarse, growing weaker with every shout. The others began to retreat, glancing at each other with dread. They realized the situation had spun beyond their control. Naomi was no longer the outsider they wanted her to be. She was the undeniable truth, the living proof of the decision made by the man they all revered. In that swift reversal, Naomi felt her heart racing, but not from fear. She knew the road ahead would still be hard. But this moment proved one thing. No insult, no cruelty had been able to bury the truth. And she, Naomi Ellis, had risen from the ashes of their contempt to become the chosen one. That room, once believed to be Gregory's stage, had become the monument of a stunning reversal. And at its center, Naomi stood tall, eyes unwavering, holding firm to the words she had spoken. Words now etched into the memory of all who had heard them. "He chose me, whether you accept it or not." The final line from Attorney Whitman had barely been spoken when Gregory roared like a cornered animal. He threw his chair aside, the wood slamming hard against the floor, then charged toward Naomi, his face burning red, eyes wild. Veins bulged across his neck, and his hand reached forward like it was ready to crush anything it touched. The room exploded into panic. Screams echoed, wine spilled across the stone floor. Glass shattered and scattered like sparks under the chandelier light. Officer Kane and Officer Doyle rushed forward, arms extended, blocking Gregory like a wall of steel. But instead of calming him, the action made him scream louder, voice hoarse and furious. "Move! She doesn't deserve to sit here," he thrashed, slamming his hand against Doyle's arm, the sound of his rage bouncing off the walls, breaking the tension into full-blown chaos. Family members jumped to their feet, some shouting to throw Naomi out, others frozen, pale, as the situation spun out of control. Naomi stayed in her seat, shoulders straight, her eyes steady. Her heart pounded hard, but she didn't let fear shake her. As Gregory lunged toward her in his frenzy, Naomi lifted her chin and spoke firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos of screams and dragging chairs. "The more you do this, the more you prove the truth." The word, brief and sharp, sliced straight into the unfolding scene, forcing many in the room to pause and turn their attention to her. Gregory faltered for a moment, then kept struggling, but his eyes had started to shift. Naomi's words echoed across the room, turning his fury into his own undoing. Attorney Whitman struck his pen against the table again, his voice clear and commanding, calling for order. But in that moment, it was Naomi's presence that drew every eye, not as the target of ridicule, but as a mirror exposing Gregory's collapse. Voices clashed and rose again, some trying to calm the storm, others still rallying behind Gregory to force Naomi out. The floor was littered with shards of glass and tablecloths stained with red wine. But in the middle of it all, Naomi sat tall, her gaze calm, as if her stillness alone had become the blade making her opponents retreat. In a moment where everything threatened to fall apart, she had quietly shifted the balance, turning the outburst into undeniable proof. The most violent one in the room had just confirmed she was the rightful heir. Attorney Whitman gripped the file tightly, his fingers trembling slightly, but his eyes were sharp, filled with resolve. Amid the shouting, arguing, and chaos, his voice rose, every word clear and deliberate. "It is notarized, indisputable." The sound echoed through the room, firm as a hammer striking down, forcing everything to pause for a beat. The pages in his hand, sealed and verified by the court, were the only weapon capable of stopping the human storm rising around him. Some were stunned, a few looked away, but most remained defiant, their whispers rising again like a swarm of disturbed bees. The room instantly became a battlefield, where every word was a weapon, every insult a strike. Gregory still stood, veins bulging in his neck, voice hoarse, as he shouted accusations that Whitman had been bribed, that Naomi had staged the whole scheme. His allies joined in, demanding to re-examine every signature, every stamp. A woman slammed her hand on the table, declaring that this family would never let an orphan force her way in. Others stayed quiet, their eyes uncertain, not bold enough to speak out, but beginning to feel doubt about the truth buried beneath it all. Naomi watched in silence, sensing that this elegant room had become a war zone. The velvet drapes, the glittering chandeliers, the fine formal wear, all of it now served as a backdrop to a brawl of words. Every sentence was laced with venom, every stare a blade aimed at her. But unlike when she first entered, Naomi no longer felt small or hopeless. She saw that the chaos itself was proof of internal collapse, and the louder they screamed, the more helpless they appeared. Attorney Whitman held the file steady and reread a portion of the will, emphasizing that Edward Monroe's final wish had been clearly stated and could not be undone by protest. His voice was calm and firm, drawing resentment from some, but that steadiness stood like a pillar that would not fall. Gregory let out a bitter laugh, shouting that the will was a joke, that Naomi had never belonged to the family. Each word he threw was laced with poison, but with every sentence, his fear became more visible. Others began to rise, forming small groups locked in heated debate. Some sided with Gregory, angrily demanding to overturn the will. The rest remained silent, but it was not the silence of agreement. It was a crack forming in the wall of pride. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to trust Gregory's fury or the stamped, sealed documents before them. The noise rose in waves, with shouting, cursing, and breaking glass, mixing with the clatter of shoes over marble. Naomi remained seated, her eyes carefully scanning each person. She saw the division clearly, saw how once proud faces were now contorted with rage. Amid the chaos, she spoke a single line that echoed like fuel to a growing fire. The more you resist, the more you prove the truth has slipped beyond your control. Some turned to look at her. A few bit their lips in anger, and others hesitated when their eyes met her calm. It was Naomi's stillness that made all the shouting around her feel small and meaningless. The war of words grew more intense, and the attacks were no longer just aimed at Naomi, but now turned on Attorney Whitman. They threatened lawsuits, vowed to do whatever it took to overturn the decision. Whitman stood tall, his gaze unwavering, answering briefly that none of it would matter, as the law would protect what was lawful. His words didn't calm the storm, they fueled it, but for Naomi, they were a reminder that she was no longer standing alone. The room turned into a storm, the noise of voices drowning out the sounds from outside. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch in judgment, the eyes of past generations witnessing the chaos unfold, as if disapproving of the cruelty of their descendants. Naomi realized this was no longer just a will reading. It had become a battle for honor, where people used whatever words they could to tear each other apart in a desperate bid to hold on to power. But within that battle, she clearly saw who was trembling, who was being pushed back. Gregory kept screaming, but his voice was hoarse now, his eyes bloodshot, his hand shaking as it gripped the edge of the table. He shouted meaningless words, but to Naomi, he was no longer a threat, just a broken man exposing his own desperation. And that desperation, combined with shattered glass, raised voices, and the stench of spilled liquor in the air, had turned this elegant room into a battleground of resentment, where every word lost value except for the truth it could no longer hide. Naomi Ellis had been chosen, and no one could deny it. The shouting still echoed when Gregory suddenly slammed his fist onto the table. The heavy thud reverberated through the room, startling several people as a wine glass bounced, spilling its contents onto the tiled floor. His face flushed deep red, veins bulging at his temple, eyes wild with fury. He roared, sharp and manic, "I'll sue to the end!" The words shot out like a vow, thickening the already suffocating air. Some relatives joined in, nodding and shouting in agreement, clinging to that as the only escape from their exposed defeat. Meanwhile, Officer Kane stepped forward, his face hardening, eyes sharp with hatred. He stared directly at Naomi, his voice heavy like a boulder rolling down a cliff. "You'll never know peace." The room fell silent for a few seconds, not because of surprise, but because his words crossed a line. It was no longer a dispute, but a personal threat. His aggression radiated through the air, turning resistance into a sentence directed solely at Naomi. regardless of the certified truth. Naomi inhaled deeply, straightened her back, and looked directly at the two men now sharpening their rage toward her. A tide of complex emotions swelled within, fear mingled with resolve. The threats fell like blades, yet they also laid bare the helplessness of Gregory and Kane. They had no arguments left, no legal ground to stand on, only raised voices and shadows of hate. Their anger didn't shake Naomi. It only confirmed that she now stood where they feared to see her. Attorney Whitman struck his pen on the table, his voice ringing firm, reminding everyone that the will was legal and irreversible. He stated that any lawsuit would fail, as every document, signature, and procedure had been verified in court. Yet Gregory refused to back down, turning to scream in Whitman's face, calling him a traitor, a man bought and sold. Each word only revealed the truth more clearly. Gregory was unraveling, his aggression a mask for pride. He was slowly being torn apart by fear. The room became a battlefield, not between right and wrong, but between truth and wounded pride. The family split into two, one group still shouting about lawsuits, the other silent, eyes clouded with fatigue and doubt. No one dared meet Naomi's gaze, for in her eyes was a strange light, strong and steady, as if she had crossed the threshold of endurance and turned it into strength. Naomi lifted her chin. Her voice rang out, clear and cold. "Go ahead. Sue me, if that's what you think will help. But the more you fight, the more you prove how much you fear the truth." Her words were neither loud nor harsh, but their weight made Gregory falter. Some in the room exchanged uneasy glances, unsettled by the confidence in her tone. They realized Naomi was no longer the girl humiliated at the beginning. She had become someone who could face any challenge. Gregory clenched his teeth, his hands trembling with rage, but his eyes wavered, no longer steady as before. Officer Kane still stood in front of him, but the aggression in his voice couldn't mask the unease in his gaze. Naomi could feel it. The more they threatened, the more they swore vengeance. The heavier the truth became, a burden they could no longer escape. The battle in that room was no longer about inheritance, but a clash between prejudice and dignity. And in that clash, Naomi Ellis had stood her ground, turning those threats into proof of the fear that was driving her opponents to lose their grip on reason. Naomi looked directly at Gregory and Officer Kane, her breathing steady, cutting through the room's burning hostility. Her voice rang out, not loud, but clear enough for all to hear, each word firm. "I'm ready to face it." The statement dropped into the tension like a stone in still water, silencing whispers and curbing anger, its weight freezing several expressions. No longer trembling, no longer looking down, Naomi now stood where none had expected her to, forcing those who had claimed power to confront the truth. She wasn't afraid. The shouting faded. Those who had rallied behind Gregory began to hesitate. Their eyes wavered, no longer blazing as they once had. Some whispered, uncertain, their confidence rattled by Naomi's calm defiance. Her composure cracked the wall of contempt surrounding her. No one had the certainty to shout anymore, nor the courage to step forward. A few retreated quietly to their seats, each backward step ringing louder than any protest, signaling that Gregory's rage no longer held unanimous support. Gregory kept shouting, but the louder he got, the fewer stood with him. The eyes that once gleamed with fury now avoided his. Some even dropped to the table to hide their confusion. His fury, instead of affirming his power, exposed his growing isolation. Naomi saw it clearly, and in that fleeting moment, she realized she was no longer alone. The silence was shifting in her favor, giving her the ground that Gregory had lost. Officer Kane glanced around, recognizing the cracks in their united front. His eyes flickered with doubt, and his voice lost its edge as he tried to hurl a few more bitter words. But Naomi sat tall, face calm, gaze firm, as if their resistance no longer had the strength to reach her. That quiet strength made it harder for others to keep pretending they stood with Gregory. The room, once filled with scornful laughter, settled into a heavy silence. Avoided stares, hesitant steps backward, all of it painted a new picture. Naomi had used her resolve to shift the entire balance. Every wavering gaze in that room was proof that she had reached what threats could never destroy, the belief that the truth would eventually stand with the one brave enough to face it. And in that moment, Naomi Ellis was no longer the target surrounded, but the center, forcing those who had mocked her to retreat. The will reading ended in chaos, with overturned chairs and shards of glass still scattered across the tiled floor. But while the crystal lights in that lavish room still cast their glow, outside, another storm had begun to form, one so powerful that no one in the Monroe family could control it. A short video, filmed from a distant corner with a phone, suddenly surfaced on social media. Within hours, Footage of Naomi Ellis sitting upright, eyes steady amidst insults, and the moment when lawyer Whitman declared the entire estate belonged to her, spread everywhere. At first, few believed it was real, but the more they watched, the more people were swept into the data storm. Online platform, already familiar with scandals involving wealthy families, exploded over footage unlike anything seen before. It was shared at lightning speed, with comments piling up by the second. Mockery aimed at Gregory and his allies flooded in, mixed with admiration for Naomi. On Twitter, the hashtags #Naomi Ellis and #inherited everything shot to the top of the trending list within half a day, becoming the center of every conversation. Each share, each comment, fueled the story like wildfire through dry brush, unstoppable. Prominent media personalities were quick to seize the moment. They reposted the video with a brief caption, "A young woman faces an entire powerful family and wins." The post racked up hundreds of thousands of likes and tens of thousands of comments. People discussed Naomi's expression when she declared the truth would come out, contrasting it with Gregory's furious, helpless outbursts. That stark contrast sparked a deep wave of sympathy, casting Naomi not just as an heiress, but as a symbol of justice. On TikTok, short clips of the video were set to dramatic music, captions reading, "What would you do if you were Naomi?" racking up millions of views. Users recreated the scenario, and even launched challenges to stand strong in the face of ridicule, all inspired by her. Thousands of young people used the hashtag to show support, turning Naomi into a face of resilience, regardless of background. Meanwhile, mainstream media began to weigh in. Online news outlets ran bold headlines, publishing long-form articles asking hard questions about the injustice Naomi endured in that room. One widely shared piece read, "In a room bathed in golden light, a black girl became the target of contempt, but in the end, it was the truth that silenced the room." These words etched themselves deeper into the public's consciousness, revealing that the story was no longer just about inheritance, but a battle for dignity and justice. Naomi had yet to say a word, but her silence only fueled public curiosity. People waited for an official statement from her, but even without it, the wave of support kept rising. Analytical videos and live streams discussing the event became a nightly trend, attracting millions of views. Social justice advocates quickly joined in, presenting Naomi as evidence of the injustice many have faced. They wrote that her victory wasn't just personal, but represented all those ever been missed because of their background or the color of their skin. Gregory and his allies became the target of intense backlash. Close-up footage of his twisted, rage-filled expression, and the moments Kane and Doyle stood menacingly in front of Naomi, spread with biting captions. People called them the embodiment of rotting arrogance. Men who lost the moment they chose to shout instead of face the truth. The growing resentment turned their images into symbols of disgrace, appearing across political forums and entertainment sites alike. The media storm turned Naomi into a household name. In schools, her story was told as one of inspiration. In coffee shops, people talked about her courage. And across social media, the image of Naomi holding her head high in a hostile room became an icon. The hashtag #Naomi Ellis went beyond an inheritance case. It became a slogan for anyone seeking to assert their dignity in the face of injustice. The golden room that once seemed set to crush Naomi instead became the stage that launched her into the spotlight. The mockery, the hostility, all of it unknowingly laid the groundwork for the moment the will was announced, and that moment, caught on camera and amplified online, became something no one could erase. In the eye of the social media storm, Naomi was no longer a lone figure. She had come to represent millions fighting for justice. Public outrage exploded once the footage of the will reading spread widely. Scenes of Naomi sitting silently amid jeers, Gregory's mocking laugh, and the aggression from Kane and Doyle became undeniable evidence of public humiliation. Thousands of comments poured in within hours, with people furious at the blatant discrimination and abuse of power taking place during what should have been a solemn reading. Online articles filled with phrases like "shameful," "a disgrace to a wealthy family," and "a slap in the face of justice," all aimed directly at those who treated Naomi's humiliation as entertainment. That outrage didn't stay confined to a few angry comments. It grew into a movement demanding justice. Major news outlets ran constant coverage, while social commentators analyzed the inequality embedded in the event, pointing out that Naomi wasn't just insulted as an individual, but targeted as a symbol of long-standing prejudice tied to race and class. Human rights advocates quickly spoke out, urging the public to see Naomi's story as a wake-up call, a reminder that open disdain still thrives even in places considered the most civilized. They warned that what happened in that gilded room was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, systemic problem that many continue to ignore. The outrage grew as short clips from the video replayed across television and online platforms. Viewers saw the stark contrast between a thin, tense but unwavering Naomi and a screaming Gregory, his face twisted in fury. Scenes of Kane lowering his voice to threaten, or Doyle slamming his folder on the table, were looped repeatedly, each replay sparking thousands more angry comments. People said there could be no justice where a young woman must endure a storm of hateful words right in front of everyone. In that storm, Naomi suddenly became a symbol. Images of her holding her head high, eyes shining as she declared, "The truth will come out," or calmly facing Gregory's rage, were quoted, printed on posters, and shared at lightning speed. Young designers turned those moments into artwork, displaying them in small galleries or spreading them online, treating Naomi as an icon of resilience. Hashtags supporting her became gathering points for millions, from people who had been shamed to those just awakening to social injustice, all united in naming Naomi as proof that dignity cannot be crushed. Online discussions shifted, moving from fury at Gregory and the two officers to admiration for Naomi's quiet strength. People wrote that her composure amid hostility was what truly moved them and earned their trust. In the public's eyes, Naomi was no longer just a girl who happened to inherit wealth, but a symbol of justice, long denied. They began comparing her to historical figures who rose above injustice, turning a personal inheritance story into a collective lesson. Naomi never appeared in the media, never issued a formal statement, yet her silence only deepened public curiosity and empathy. People saw in her someone cornered and humiliated who still chose to uphold her dignity rather than lash out or break down. That made the name Naomi Ellis rise above any sensational headline, becoming a message of inspiration, that strength doesn't lie in shouting louder, but in standing firm when the world turns its back. By the next morning, Naomi was no longer the girl mocked in a room of power, but a symbol admired by millions. Her story spread everywhere, breaking past the walls of the Monroe family and leaving a deep mark on society. The public chose to stand with her, transforming the humiliation Naomi endured into fuel for compassion and resistance. And from that moment on, Naomi Ellis was not only the heir to a fortune, but the face of a movement to reclaim dignity for those who had long been dismissed. The next morning, while public outrage had yet to settle, another shock emerged, turning an already fierce storm into a full-blown explosion. An audio recording, less than 3 minutes long, was released online, shared by a staff member who had been present during the will reading. In it, Gregory Hale's voice rang out clearly, cold and calculated, speaking to Officer Kane in a secluded corner. "We need to humiliate her before the will is read." That single sentence was enough to spark millions of angry reactions, each word repeated endlessly across news outlets and social media, serving as undeniable proof that Naomi's humiliation had been a premeditated scheme. The audio revealed even more. Gregory discussed how Naomi's presence was unacceptable, that everyone must treat her as an outsider, and the verbal attacks would crush her before the lawyer could speak. Kane did not object, even added to the plan, suggesting that if needed, he could use his position as a police officer to escalate pressure. What was once meant to remain buried in shadows was now dragged into the light and spread at lightning speed, becoming the epicenter of public fury. News outlets immediately published in-depth analyses, calling it a dirty plot and a deliberate scheme to destroy the dignity of the rightful heir. Social commentators dissected every word, pointing out that this wasn't a moment of heat during a chaotic meeting, but a calculated conspiracy crafted well in advance. The outrage grew louder, no longer just over the insults Naomi endured at the will reading, focused on the sheer cruelty behind Gregory and Kane's coordinated effort. Online, the recording went viral. Hashtags like #ExposedGregory and #KaneComplicit flooded timelines, accompanied by sharp, unforgiving commentary. Many expressed horror at Gregory's icy tone, as he plotted to shame a young woman, while others demanded formal investigations and legal action. Every comment, every share, pushed Gregory and Kane further into a corner, stripping away any illusion of dominance and turning them into targets of relentless condemnation. Naomi had yet to make a public appearance, but her name was mentioned more than ever. People asked, how could one woman remain standing in the face of such a vile setup? That very question made Naomi's image shine even brighter in the eyes of the public. She was no longer just the unexpected heir, but a living testament to dignity and resilience. While Gregory and Kane drowned in backlash, Naomi was lifted higher as the embodiment of grace under attack. The leak of the audio recording triggered not only social outrage, but also legal and political consequences. Legal experts commented that, with such clear evidence, an investigation investigation into Gregory and Kane's collusion and abuse of power would be inevitable. The police department's internal affairs unit received thousands of petitions demanding Kane's suspension, while independent attorneys stated Naomi had every right to file a civil lawsuit for defamation. These analyses flooded the media, turning a family conflict into a public issue involving the legal system. The recording did more than expose a plot. It revealed that Naomi had been surrounded by a stage deliberately set up to break her down from the start. The public, upon realizing this, grew even more sympathetic, writing that Naomi's calm silence during the will reading was now more admirable than ever. If people had been outraged by what they saw and heard before, they now had irrefutable proof that the entire ordeal had been orchestrated. In that moment, Naomi Ellis was no longer just a symbol, but the central figure of a growing movement demanding transparency and justice for all. As the recording spread, the press responded with fierce condemnation. Major newspapers ran furious headlines like, "Plot to humiliate the legal heir," and "Gregory Hale's dirty orchestration uncovered." Articles included detailed breakdowns of the tape, highlighting Gregory's calculated tone and Officer Kane's enabling role. One publication even placed the quote, "We need to humiliate her before the will is read," on its front page, calling it evidence of the moral collapse of a once revered family. National TV networks invited experts to comment on the abuse of authority and racial bias, framing the incident as more than a property dispute. It had become a societal test of justice. Public outrage showed no signs of fading, and opinion pieces poured in like sharpened spears aimed directly at Gregory and Kane. Some journalists wrote that their actions insulted not only Naomi, but also the integrity of the law itself by mocking the transparency of a notarized will reading. Others used harsher language, calling Gregory an unworthy heir driven by arrogance, and Kane a shadow of power exploited for personal gain. These words filled newspapers, radio programs, and online platforms, building a wall of justice from language, forcing the guilty to face the truth. Beyond the articles, televised panels continued to bring the story into the spotlight. Legal experts analyzed the evidence, concluding that a criminal investigation was inevitable. Sociologists argued that Naomi was not an isolated case, but a stand-in for millions who had been excluded because of their background and skin color. They emphasized that public outrage was the driving force needed to break long-standing chains of injustice. While the world outside boiled over, Naomi chose to sit quietly in the small room where she was staying. She made no statements to the media, no appearances in public. Outside, the storm of public outrage was pulling Gregory and Kane into its spiral. But inside, Naomi leaned back in her chair, listening as her heartbeat slowly steadied. She remembered every insult, every look of contempt during the will reading, remembered the feeling of being surrounded by dozens of hostile voices. And now, with those schemes exposed, she realized the balance was beginning to tip toward justice. In that moment, Naomi didn't feel triumphant or tearful, only a quiet peace rising within her. She knew she wasn't alone. The outrage of the public had become her voice, a response to every time she had been dismissed. For the first time in days of tension, she could take a deep breath without feeling the weight pressing on her chest. Justice was returning, not because she had shouted, but because the truth had spoken for itself. Naomi sat still, her eyes fixed on the small window where morning light slipped through the glass and filled the silent room. That light reminded her that no matter how fierce the storm, the sun still rises. Within her echoed a simple belief that justice, even when delayed, would come, and that truth could never remain hidden forever. And with that belief, Naomi Ellis knew she had entered a new chapter, where she was no longer the target of ridicule, but the living proof that justice was being restored. After the leaked audio and a series of supporting evidence surfaced, the Internal Affairs Department officially announced the opening of an investigation into the misconduct of Officers Kane and Doyle. The announcement was broadcast during the morning news, accompanied by images of the two uniformed men who had once stood in front of Naomi, their faces frozen mid-frame in expressions of hostility and aggression. The public reacted strongly, viewing the move as a necessary step toward ending the abuse of power. News outlets affirmed that the presence of these biased officers during the will reading had severely damaged the image of the police force and could not be dismissed as isolated behavior. Internal investigators began working swiftly. Kane and Doyle's personnel files were reopened, and previously overlooked reports were now scrutinized. Several past complaints of abuse of authority, once buried, were cross-referenced with the leaked audio, forming a chain of evidence that left both men with no ground to deny wrongdoing. Interrogations followed one after another, the cold lighting of the interview rooms casting sharp shadows on the hardened faces of the officers who were once used to giving orders, now forced to lower their eyes under relentless questioning. Simultaneously, Gregory Hale was placed under special investigation. A wide range of his financial documents was seized, and within days, investigators discovered clear signs of bribery. Several questionable transactions appeared in his records, wired directly to accounts linked to decision-makers in the region. A leaked report revealed that Gregory had paid Kane and Doyle to assist during the will reading, ensuring Naomi would be undermined and isolated. When this information was released, public outrage exploded once more. Cries for prosecution filled social media, demanding Gregory be held accountable for both corruption and conspiring to distort a lawful testament. The media quickly dug deeper. Journalists uncovered evidence that Gregory had previously used his influence to evade several minor lawsuits related to financial misconduct. Reputable newspapers labeled him a man of privileged blood who operates with disgraceful tactics. One columnist wrote, "Gregory Hale not only failed to claim the inheritance, but also exposed himself as a man willing to bribe justice itself to feed his ego." These words made front-page headlines, further destroying Gregory's reputation with no chance of recovery. Naomi, meanwhile, remained silent. She followed the news on the small screen, listening as the anchors read aloud the latest evidence. Her heart filled with a feeling both relieving and surreal. Each passing day felt like justice was being pieced back together from fragments. If once she had been the only one to face the scorn in that room, now society had become the witness, and those who once mocked her were being dragged into the light. Legal experts affirmed that with the growing chain of clear evidence, prosecution was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. Some lawmakers even referenced the case in public session, calling it a prime example of unchecked abuse of power in need of swift action. The pressure from the public and political circles left the authorities with no room for delay. The first hearings were scheduled, and the news spread like a warning bell, signaling the inevitable downfall of Gregory and the two complicit officers. Naomi understood that justice does not arrive in a single day, but every step of the investigation strengthened her resolve. She sat quietly in the corner of her small room, listening to each news up, feeling her heart slowly emerge from the weight that had gripped. The pain she had endured during the will reading was now being answered by the exposure of truth. And in that moment, Naomi Ellis knew that what she had patiently endured was finally yielding results, as justice was no longer a distant idea, but a reality beginning to take shape. The official summons date was announced, and the press swarmed the street leading to the investigative headquarters. Gregory Hale stepped out of a luxury car, his face struggling to maintain composure while his eyes betrayed confusion. Behind him, Officer Kane and Officer Doyle were escorted in, their uniforms, once symbols of authority, now serving as reminders of disgrace. Cameras clicked rapidly, and reporters shouted over one another. "Do you admit to the bribery? What do you say about the recording?" But all questions were ignored. Their awkward silence under the lenses only deepened the public's perception of their downfall. In the brightly lit interrogation room, each was called in one by one. Gregory sat across from two investigators, his face pale as financial records were placed in front of him. Each wire transfer read aloud. He tried to argue, claiming they were legitimate business dealings, but the pointed questions exposed contradictions in his statements. His hands, slick with sweat, tapped nervously on the cold steel table. With every passing second, his pride eroded, revealing a desperate man clinging to a power already lost. Kane and Doyle fared no better. The two officers who had once barked orders during the will reading were now forced to answer for every action. The recording was replayed multiple times, Kane's voice ringing out clearly, each word of "she needs to be humiliated" becoming irrefutable evidence. Doyle was questioned about throwing the notebook in front of Naomi, about the threats he had made. Both of them fumbled, voices shaky, explanations inconsistent, sometimes lapsing into hollow silence. The entire scene was documented in detail, prepared for the official report to be released to the public. While the proceedings continued, Naomi was invited as a witness. She walked down the long hallway, fluorescent lights casting a calm glow on her face. Sitting behind a one-way mirror, Naomi watched everything unfold. She saw Gregory, no longer the arrogant man demanding her removal, but a figure biting his lip, avoiding the investigator's gaze. She saw Kane and Doyle, who once stood like iron walls in front of her, now bowing their heads, stumbling through excuses. Each moment passed before her eyes like a film in stark contrast to the days she had endured humiliation. Naomi didn't smile, nor did she feel triumphant. What she felt was a heavy kind of release. Seeing their downfall firsthand, she understood that justice did not require vengeance, only exposure. Those who had tried to bury her dignity were now laid bare by the truth. She didn't need to shout to prove anything, because the light from the evidence had already spoken for her. The interrogation room was another kind of stage, but this time Naomi wasn't the one under siege. She sat quietly, fully aware that the balance had shifted. The sound of an investigator's pen signing a report echoed like a closing bell, marking the end of a dark conspiracy. As she left the building, Naomi took a deep breath, and the air outside felt clearer than ever. She knew the road ahead would still be long, but the moment she witnessed the collapse of Gregory, Kane, and Doyle confirmed one thing: the truth always finds its way to light, no matter how many walls of lies are built to hide it. The day Gregory and the two officers stepped out of the interrogation, dozens of cameras were already waiting at the gates, flashes exploding non-stop, reporters shouting over each other to ask questions. Gregory tried to maintain composure, but when pressed about the recording and the bribes, he erupted in fury. His eyes bloodshot, face twisted in rage, he screamed into the cameras, voice cracking with anger. "She stole everything from me!" His cry echoed through loudspeakers and instantly spread across live news feeds. That outburst, rather than regaining any sympathy, exposed the raw desperation of a man who had failed to hold on to power through tricks and schemes. The press didn't miss the moment. Microphones pushed forward, questions flying about what Gregory hoped to prove, whether he denied the bribe. But all they got in return were evasions and meaningless shouts. The footage was streamed live, and soon, across social media, millions saw the once proud Gregory unravel, clinging to bitterness to mask the truth. Comments poured in, mocking his words as a symbol of collapse. Meanwhile, Naomi exited through a separate path, still surrounded by reporters, but without the chaos. She paused briefly, her gaze calm as she looked into the line of cameras pointed at her. No lengthy speech, no dramatic gesture, just a single, clear statement. The truth is never theft. The words, soft but razor-sharp, cut straight through Gregory's scream. For a moment, the reporters fell silent, then quickly reacted. That brief clip of Naomi's response was shared at lightning speed, garnering millions of likes and thousands of comments praising her. People saw that while Gregory drowned in rage, Naomi needed only one sentence to claim her place. That evening, every news program showed the contrasting images side by side. Gregory shouting, finger pointed at the lens, face contorted, and Naomi composed, eyes steady with conviction. The contrast solidified public opinion that she was the only one worthy of the inheritance. Analysts remarked that Naomi's brief statement was the key, not just responding to Gregory, but to anyone who had doubted her. Rather than defend herself, she affirmed that truth could never be equated with theft, and justice speaks for itself. That day's scene became a turning point. Gregory lost control in front of the cameras, while Naomi earned unwavering respect. International media picked up the story, framing it as proof of a battle between lies and truth. They wrote that Gregory, through his greed, had made himself a public loser, while Naomi, with nothing more than quiet clarity, asserted dignity and victory without needing to argue further. Naomi returned to her temporary residence, sitting quietly in the still room. She knew every word spoken would echo far. On her phone screen, notifications kept appearing. Messages of support, articles praising her flooded in. Inside, there was no loud pride, only a quiet exhale of relief, because finally, what she had chosen, silence when needed, speaking up at the right moment, had allowed the public to see the truth for what it was. To Naomi Ellis, that one sentence was never meant to defeat Gregory, but to remind everyone of a simple truth. Justice isn't something granted or stolen. It exists on its own when truth is revealed. The moment Naomi's brief statement was heard, the crowd outside the building, initially just spectators, suddenly erupted into a wave of cheers. It started with a few scattered claps, then quickly turned into a roar as the whole crowd began chanting her name. "Naomi! Naomi!" The voices rose from hundreds of throats, building into a steady, thunderous rhythm like war drum. Small flags with the word justice were raised high, and handmade signs declaring the truth waved passionately in the hands of demonstrators. The heated atmosphere of the morning transformed into a spontaneous celebration, as the crowd found in her a new symbol to rally behind. That sound carried through the nearby streets, drawing more curious onlookers who merged into the growing crowd. Many reporters turned their cameras toward Naomi, capturing the moment she smiled softly, her eyes shimmering with emotion. She didn't need to say another word, because the crowd was speaking for her. The chants became a shield, erasing the days she was seen as an outsider, scorned in a grand, gilded room. Now, in front of everyone, she was no longer alone, but the center of a rising movement. Meanwhile, Gregory remained in place, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. The thunderous chants only pushed him further out of control, his eyes wild, lips muttering curses no one could fully hear. A few reporters pointed their cameras directly at his face, capturing every contorted frame of a man who had completely lost composure. He waved his hands, trying to push them away, only making the scene more pitiful. To the public, he was no longer the proud heir, but a defeated man thrashing in public disgrace. When security forces arrived, the situation became clear. Two uniformed officers approached, gripping Gregory's arm, pulling him away from the press and the crowd. He tried to break free, struggling like a man cornered, shouting that it was all lies. But his words were drowned out by the crowd's chants, by the cheers calling Naomi's name. The image of a man who once sat smugly at the head of the table, now being dragged away under the glare of hundreds of cameras, became the defining symbol of collapse. Gregory's dragging footsteps made the scene all the more bitter. His collar was wrinkled, his face was soaked with sweat, and his expensive leather shoes struck the cement floor with heavy, echoing thuds. Reporters didn't miss a second, capturing every moment, and almost instantly, images of Gregory being escorted away spread across news outlets. On social media, those photos flooded timelines, accompanied by mocking captions. "The arrogant man of yesterday is now just a silhouette being dragged away." Naomi paused for a few seconds, watching the group lead Gregory toward the car. She didn't shout, didn't cheer, just exhaled deeply. Her silence stood in stark contrast to the crowd's wild chants. Yet, it was that very composure that made people admire her more, because in the midst of chaos, she maintained calm, letting the truth speak for itself and allowing her enemy to become a living testament to his own helplessness. Kane and Doyle followed behind Gregory, their steps heavy, eyes avoiding contact. They were no longer the aggressive men hurling threats at Naomi, but two silent shadows, drowned out by chants of protest. All three were taken away in public disgrace, under hundreds of stares from the crowd, and thousands more watching through screens. No trace of authority remained in them, only the image of men who had thrown themselves into the abyss through greed and deceit. The crowd continued chanting Naomi's name, transforming a tense morning into a quiet moment of history. A group of students held banners reading, "Dignity cannot be buried," while another began singing, the melody echoing across the open space. The support spread swiftly, from the packed street to live TV broadcasts, and further across social media. People said Naomi had not only won an inheritance case, but had restored faith for those who had been pushed aside. In the moment Gregory was dragged away, Naomi became an undeniable symbol. Her earlier words had planted the seed of belief, but this scene became the living proof of justice turning. Applause erupted. Chants thundered, not to celebrate someone's downfall, but to honor the resolve of a young woman who dared to stand in a room full of hostility. Naomi Ellis, with calm and courage, turned the shame of yesterday into a resounding victory, etched in the memory of all who witnessed that day. On the day of the official hearing, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation and weeks of pent-up outrage. Hundreds of reporters had arrived early, cameras and microphones aimed at the main entrance, waiting for the moment the once arrogant figures would appear. When the doors opened, Kane, Doyle, and Gregory walked in, escorted to the defendant's bench. Their faces glistened with sweat, eyes vacant, with no trace of the arrogance that had once overwhelmed Naomi during the will reading. Murmurs erupted throughout the courtroom, and several couldn't hold back their anger, but the presiding judge quickly signaled for silence. Gregory tried to hold his head high, but his eyes darted anxiously, as if searching for a way out. Kane stood stiffly, tension visible in his clenched fingers. Doyle remained silent, his gaze dull, seemingly aware that what was coming could no longer be undone. They had once held control in that lavish room, but now they faced justice, where every word and piece of evidence would be exposed before the public. In that heavy atmosphere, Attorney Whitman rose from the witness bench, holding a thick file. He stepped forward slowly, voice deep and steady, presenting all legal documents to the court. Each page he turned felt like a blade cutting through the wall of lies. He submitted the notarized original will, testimony from a bank employee confirming Gregory's suspicious transfers, and an audio recording revealing that Naomi's humiliation had been premeditated. The courtroom fell silent as Whitman's voice filled the space, every word clear, omitting nothing. He didn't need grand language, only the truth, and it was that truth that made Kane, Doyle, and Gregory bow their heads. At one point, Gregory sprang up to object, but the judge struck the gavel, forcing him back into his seat. His outburst no longer inspired fear, only revealed the panic of a man who had lost everything. The financial evidence continued, bribes laid bare on the courtroom screen. The sums were so large the crowd gasped. Whispered voices called Gregory blindly greedy. Kane was interrogated for abusing his police authority to pressure Naomi. His weak explanations were instantly refuted by the recording, his own voice, cold and cruel. Doyle was not spared either, as footage of him slamming a notebook in front of Naomi during the will reading played on the screen, drawing sharp murmurs of anger from the gallery. Naomi sat in the front row, silently observing. She didn't speak or argue. Everything had been proven. Her eyes held a calm resolve, though a flicker of pain passed through them as she remembered the moment she was cornered and scorned. Now, watching those same people stand trial, she understood that justice was not revenge, but exposure, so everyone could see clearly what was real and what was not. When Whitman paused, the courtroom erupted in applause, despite the call for order. The audience couldn't contain their agreement. The judge struck the gavel again, but his gaze toward Whitman held clear admiration. What had just been presented wasn't merely legal documentation, but a mirror reflecting a society hungry for justice. Gregory panted. Kane clenched his jaw. Doyle stared at the floor, cornered with no way out. Any justification now was meaningless. Every scheme exposed. They had thought they could use power and aggression to intimidate a young woman, but in the end, it was Naomi's resolve and the transparency of the law that brought them to the defendant's bench. Naomi exhaled softly, not from exhaustion, but from knowing the truth had found its ground. That day's trial didn't just determine the fate of Gregory, Kane, and Doyle. It affirmed a truth. Justice may be delayed, but when it arrives, it shines unmistakably, and no one can deny it. Naomi sat on the witness bench, hands interlocked, back straight, eyes following every detail in the courtroom. Before her stood Gregory, Kane, and Doyle, now exposed by the light of truth, their faces pale, their words faltering. In that moment, Naomi no longer felt small, no longer the girl who once stood humiliated during the will reading, crushed under scornful words and gazes. Now, before the court, those who once dismissed her as an outsider had become the accused, and that alone ignited a steady fire in her eyes, unwavering and fierce. She didn't need to speak. Her calm presence alone made the strongest statement. Each time Attorney Whitman turned a page, Naomi watched closely. She saw every piece of evidence as an arrow piercing the wall of lies Gregory and his allies had built. When the recording played, Gregory's voice conspiring with Kane rang out clearly. Naomi looked directly at them, her gaze calm but unyielding. That look made them avert their eyes, heads bowed, as if her silence had become a mirror revealing who they truly were. A few reporters in the back row whispered to each other, realizing it was Naomi's gaze that gave the trial its undeniable strength. The audience began to feel a shift. The room, once thick with outrage, was now charged with a different energy, no longer just awaiting accusations, but witnessing the scales of justice tipping decisively. The judges exchanged looks, noted details carefully, and every piece of evidence was scrutinized. Justice, once thought buried under power and wealth, had begun to tilt. The gavel struck loudly as the judge called for silence, but the eyes across the room said everything. They believed Naomi was the one standing for the truth, while Gregory, Kane, and Doyle were merely the fading shadows of deceit. Naomi sat still, her eyes unwavering. She recalled the long days of ridicule, the moments she had to stay composed to keep from crying in front of relatives and police officers, the times she bit her lip to preserve her dignity. Now, everything was brought into the light, and those emotional wounds had become the strength that allowed her to face the truth without fear. Her resolute gaze served as a reminder that justice cannot be buried forever. It returns at the most unexpected moment. When Whitman presented the final financial analysis proving Gregory had spent money to manipulate outcomes, the courtroom buzzed with angry murmurs. Some spectators couldn't hold back, calling him greedy, a defeated man. The judge struck the gavel to restore order, but the truth was already undeniable. Naomi looked over at Gregory and caught his trembling eyes, his hand gripping the edge of the wood rail, struggling to hold on to a shred of confidence. But her gaze did not waver. It was steady, direct, like a blade slicing through every layer of disguise. In that contrast, justice became clearer than ever. One side anchored in truth and calm, the other flailing in deception. Kane was called to testify. As the investigator's voice echoed with questions about abuse of power, Naomi quietly observed. Each time Kane stumbled through a denial, she saw justice taking another step forward. Doyle, too, faced relentless questioning, sweat on his face, eyes darting away. Naomi realized they were no longer the towering walls that had blocked her during the will reading. They were now mere defendants, fragile and out of excuses. She sat without speaking, yet her steady gaze made it clear to everyone that justice was drawing closer. In the courtroom, people began looking at Naomi differently. No longer an outsider, she was seen as a witness to the power of truth. Clenched fists, silent nods, all signs that they agreed the scales had shifted. Justice, once shaken by power and disdain, was being rebuilt through clarity and dignity, and Naomi, with her steady eyes, stood at the center of that turning tide. The trial continued with tense arguments, but Naomi did not let emotion sway her. She sat quietly, listening, observing, letting the truth speak for itself. Inside her echoed an unshakable belief that every insult endured, every scheme devised, was now being stripped bare. And as justice began to turn, Naomi knew she had crossed the threshold from victim to symbol, a symbol of the belief that truth always prevails. In the crowded courtroom, where every strike of the gavel and every solemn glance resonated through the space, Naomi Ellis sat, her unwavering eyes like a monument. Justice was returning, slowly but surely, and she was the living witness to that moment. Inside her was no prideful triumph, only a deep calm, because she knew justice holds true value only when affirmed by the light of truth, not by shouting. And today, that light had begun to shine, slow but unstoppable. On sentencing day, a gray sky hung over the city as if foreshadowing a verdict that would determine not only the fate of 3 individuals seated in the courtroom, but the legacy of the Monroe name itself. Since early morning, hundreds had gathered outside the courthouse gates, some holding signs with Naomi's name, others standing still with arms folded, eyes fixed on the heavy iron gate. The air was thick with tension, hushed conversations drifted like wind, and everyone knew this day would mark a turning point, not just in a sensational trial, but in the public's understanding of justice and truth. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every velvet-lined wooden bench was filled, from reporters and relatives to curious citizens who had followed the case closely. All eyes were locked on the defendant's row, where Gregory Monroe sat motionless. His face was visibly gaunt, hair disheveled as if untouched by a comb in days. His eyes were sunken, staring blankly at the cold stone floor, fingers interlocked with tension. The man, once arrogant, calculating, and full of swagger, now appeared as a faded shadow of himself, a dim figure beneath the harsh light of justice. Beside him sat Kane and Doyle, 2 former officers who once wielded power like harbingers of fear, now equally diminished. Kane stared straight ahead, his face flushed red as if suppressing something, while Doyle slouched back, eyes half closed, not in rest, but in a silent wish to wake from a long nightmare. No shiny badge pinned to their chests, no respectful nods from peers, no control over the game. What remained were 3 heavy bodies awaiting judgment. No words exchanged. The air in the courtroom so dense it felt like it could be sliced. The aging judge, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, sat high above, resting a hand on a thick stack of case files. His eyes swept across the room, cold and steady, before he spoke in a deep voice, each word landing like a gavel strike. Having reviewed all evidence, testimonies, and the jury's conclusion, this court ruled. The entire courtroom held its breath. No whispers, no movement. Time seemed frozen. Gregory Monroe is hereby stripped of all inheritance rights pertaining to the estate of the late Edward Monroe. Furthermore, the defendant is ordered to compensate Naomi Ellis for the emotional and social harm she endured due to deliberate misconduct during the dispute. As the words fell, the room erupted in murmurs. Heads leaned close to whisper. A few audible gasps broke the tension, and some sighed in relief. Reporters immediately flipped open notebooks, recorders clicked into action, and others kept their eyes locked on courtroom monitors to transmit updates back to their newsrooms. Gregory remained seated, shoulders slumped as if crushed by a boulder. He said nothing, offered no resistance, and did not cry. He simply clenched both fists, nails digging into flesh. No matter what, he understood. This was the end of all illusion. It didn't stop there. The judge proceeded to read the verdict for Kane and Doyle. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and commanding. Kane and Doyle, formerly police officers tasked with upholding justice, abused their authority to conceal wrongdoing and conspired to serve personal interests. This conduct not only violates professional ethics in the gravest way, but also damages public trust in the justice system. The court hereby revokes your right to serve in law enforcement permanently and refers you for criminal prosecution on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of justice. Gasps of, "Oh my God," escaped from some elderly spectators. A few younger ones responded with quiet applause, while reporters rushed to capture every word of the ruling that was shifting the course of the case. Kane froze, jaw clenched, eyes flaring as if ready to object, but dropped his gaze the moment he realized he had been stripped of every ounce of power he once held. Doyle remained silent, face like stone, though his hands trembled visibly. These were the men who once wielded authority before Naomi, who acted as if they controlled others' fates, now reduced to living proof of what happens when guilt is laid bare. From the back row, Naomi sat still. She didn't move, didn't shed a tear. Her eyes rested calmly on the three men with their heads bowed, steady, but not cold. She bore no hatred, only the quiet gaze of someone who had survived destruction and now witnessed truth prevail. She exhaled deeply, a breath that seemed to lift the burden she had carried for so many months. Sleepless nights, contemptuous stares, cruel whispers, all of it faded, replaced by a stillness that felt like peace. Outside the courthouse gates, the crowd erupted as news of the verdict spread. Cheers, applause, and even tears of emotion rang out. Signs reading, "Naomi, Justice for the Truth," were held high. Television reporters, cameramen, and international journalists burst out of the courtroom to break the story live. On social media, millions of shares spread within minutes, turning the day into the most watched event of the month. Headlines appeared everywhere. Justice has prevailed. Naomi Ellis and the historic verdict. Conspiracy crushed under the weight of the law. Gregory was escorted out of the courtroom, arms limp at his sides, each heavy step dragging a shadow behind him. His face, once proud and full of confidence, was now eerily blank. The pride once gleaming in his eyes had vanished, leaving only a hollow stare, as if he no longer had a reason to look ahead. Beside him, Kane and Doyle were also led away, no longer in uniform, wearing plain clothes like petty criminals. Camera lenses tracked every step, capturing every expression, images that quickly spread across the media as evidence of fitting punishment. No one saw them as central figures in a battle over inheritance anymore, but as remnants of a system that once allowed power to be abused, now drowned by the very truth they tried to bury. Naomi came out last. She didn't rush, nor did she avoid the flashing lights. A light breeze moved through the trees outside the courthouse, brushing against her neatly tied hair. She lifted her head toward the still gray sky, though inside her, everything was clear. She knew justice today was not born of hatred or revenge, but of restored dignity. It was proof that if one remains steadfast, if one holds on to their integrity without yielding, the truth will always find a way to speak. When the judge read the final line, the courtroom seemed to freeze. He paused for a moment, as if to let everyone absorb each word. The court recognizes Naomi Ellis as the sole legal heir to the entire estate of the late Edward Monroe. The words echoed like a bell, resonating through every wall. Naomi sat upright, hands relaxed on her lap, eyes unblinking. This was more than a legal victory. It was proof of the dignity she had protected in silence, even when surrounded by doubt and contempt. The courtroom trembled, but not with shouting or chaos. A thick silence spread, one of acknowledgement. People looked at Naomi differently now, not with coldness or pity, but with respect. A few older attendees lowered their heads. Those once seated near the Monroe family now slowly nodded. That silence was a wake-up call, a reminder that no one can forever hide behind power to deny the truth. As Naomi stood, camera flashes lit up to capture the moment. She didn't beam, didn't cry. She simply nodded and stepped away from her seat like someone who had walked the longest road of their life. In the strange quiet that followed, she became the center not because of the inheritance, but because of her resolve and the way she endured without breaking. Everyone understood. Naomi wasn't granted the inheritance because she was the illegitimate child, but because she deserved it. The final gavel struck like the closing of a storm-ridden chapter. Naomi turned one last time to look at the courtroom, the place where she had once been looked down upon, once sat like an outsider, now the place where justice had spoken. She walked out of the courtroom as if stepping out of a long dream, and in the eyes of the hundreds gathered outside, she was no longer Naomi Ellis, the nameless daughter, but a symbol of a truth that could never be buried. Immediately after the verdict was announced, major news outlets released special editions, with bold headlines flooding front pages and digital billboards across the city. "The girl once humiliated now owns the legacy" became the most prominent line, repeated across hundreds of publications, turning Naomi Ellis's controversial inheritance case into a social symbol. Readers eagerly absorbed every detail. not only curious about the fortune she inherited, but more drawn to how she stood firm through humiliation to reach justice. Images from the trial, especially the moment Naomi's eyes lit up when officially recognized, were enlarged on magazine covers and became the centerpiece of evening news broadcasts. Television networks invited numerous experts to comment. Some analyzed the case as a pivotal moment in the pursuit of justice for the marginalized, while others viewed Naomi as living proof that truth, though slow, ultimately prevailed. Viewers followed every word, and social media exploded with shares. People began tagging Naomi's name as a show of solidarity, seeing her as the face of quiet strength they longed to believe in. Reenacted clips contrasting scenes of her public humiliation with the moment she was declared heir spread rapidly, bringing many to tears at the stark contrast. Under growing pressure and public interest, Naomi finally agreed to a short interview. When asked how it felt to go from being despised to legally owning a massive inheritance, she sat upright, calm-eyed, her voice steady and clear. "What I gained is bigger than money. It's the truth." That brief sentence was instantly quoted everywhere, displayed on digital billboards and in major newspapers. People shared it like a slogan, emphasizing that what mattered was not her wealth, but the recognition of a dignity once denied. The crowd listened in respectful silence. Many admitted they had initially followed the case only out of curiosity about the inheritance's value, but now, what stayed with them was a lesson in perseverance. Editorials praised Naomi for refusing to remain a permanent victim, for turning her pain into proof, and not letting shame bury the truth. One veteran columnist wrote that Naomi's words would be quoted for years to come, as a declaration of justice's strength in a society still steeped in prejudice. The case also sparked broader conversation. On television, people debated whether the law was strong enough to protect the vulnerable, and what loopholes needed closing to prevent similar schemes. On forums, thousands shared their own story, their experiences of being dismissed or oppressed. Naomi became a catalyst, transforming a personal fight into a public movement demanding more transparency and fairness. Naomi returned home after the interview, her phone still vibrating with messages from strangers expressing gratitude. Some wrote that they found courage in her eyes. Others said that because of Naomi, they believed justice still existed. Sitting by the window, Naomi smiled softly, knowing that what she had gained wasn't in the numbers of the estate, but in the spread of faith. The public's attention didn't overwhelm her. It made her feel a greater sense of responsibility, because she understood this truth wasn't just for herself, but also for those who had long been forgotten. International media began reporting on the story, comparing Naomi to figures who had shifted how society perceives justice. Her name appeared in classroom discussion, cited by teachers as an example of resilience and dignity. From a girl once mocked in a will-reading room, Naomi Ellis now lived in collective memory as a symbol of truth restored. The resonance of her story not only helped Naomi reclaim fairness, but also left a profound lesson for society, that justice, when pursued relentlessly, has the power to overcome all prejudice. And from the moment the words, "What I gained is bigger than money, it's the truth," were spoken, Naomi was no longer just an heir, but the voice of millions yearning for a fairer world. Following the brief interview that gave rise to a new rallying cry, Naomi Ellis was swiftly embraced by the public as a figure of courage. People spoke of her not only as the unexpected heir, but as a symbol of strength through perseverance in the face of bias and oppression. On online forums, thousands shared her story, alongside their own experiences of being dismissed or treated unfairly. Many admitted that seeing Naomi stand firm amidst insults gave them the motivation to stop staying silent in their own lives. Photos of her in the courtroom, her eyes bright as she listened to the verdict, were printed into posters, hung in school, library, and on the walls of community centers. Speeches at social events began using Naomi as a prime example. Speakers retold her journey as proof that strength doesn't always need to be loud, that sometimes it is calm that unravels the other side. Many civil rights organizations reached out to invite Naomi to speak at public forums, hoping her story could inspire a new generation. The public no longer saw her merely as the winner of an inheritance dispute, but as a reminder that anyone, with steadfast truth, can shift the balance of justice. That momentum quickly crossed national borders. International media covered the story extensively. From Europe to Asia, from Africa to South America, Naomi Ellis became a name featured across global headlines. Major newspapers published her photo with titles like, "The girl once humiliated now becomes a global symbol of dignity." International television replayed the moment Naomi sat quietly in court, intercut with images of Gregory shouting in despair, creating a stark contrast that resonated deeply with audiences across cultures. Global talk shows analyzed the story's meaning, calling it a reminder that discrimination and abuse of power exist everywhere, but also proof that truth can transcend borders and reach the hearts of millions. Some foreign journalists traveled directly to interview her, describing Naomi in simple but powerful words: a young woman whose eyes hold dignity, an heir to truth more than wealth. These articles were translated into multiple languages, shared widely, and sparked a wave of support from people who had never known her before. Naomi's story made its way into educational broadcasts, classroom discussions in language and history classes, and even community meetings across nations. What began as a seemingly personal inheritance dispute had become material for global conversations about dignity and justice. During those days, Naomi maintained her modest way of life. She didn't chase spotlights or try to turn herself into a public figure, but that humility only deepened public admiration. People saw her as proof that courage doesn't need performance. It is the outcome of staying aligned with truth. Each time Naomi's image appeared on international media, the response poured in: messages of gratitude, empathy, and encouragement that she had made the world a better place. International panels began referencing Naomi as a source of inspiration. At a human rights conference in Geneva, a speaker quoted her line, "What I gained is bigger than money. It's the truth," and the entire hall applauded. At a symposium in South Africa, an image of Naomi in the courtroom was projected on a large screen, and the audience stood to show their respect. The reach of her story was no longer just about exposing one family's scheme. It had become a global emblem of how an individual can confront injustice with resolve and dignity. When Naomi saw her image appear in international news, she felt no pride. She sat quietly in her familiar room, reading the headlines with a calm gaze. Deep inside, she understood that what people saw was only part of the story. What she valued was not fame, but the fact that the public had chosen her story as a reminder of justice. For Naomi Ellis, that truth was the greatest legacy she hoped to leave behind, far beyond the figures written in the will. And in that moment, as her name was spoken in many different languages, she realized the journey she had taken was no longer hers alone. It had become a shared lesson for the world. After the case closed and public attention gradually faded like a thin mist, dissolving over a quiet lake, Naomi Ellis did not choose to live in the dazzling spotlight of her newfound status as an heiress. She did not appear at social events, did not grace fashion magazine covers, nor did she become a symbol of high society as many had predicted. Instead, she quietly stepped behind the scenes and began working on a long-cherished plan, one deeply shaped by a past she never forgot. In a small office lined with oak, where morning light streamed through the old trees outside the window, Naomi carefully drafted the outlines of a scholarship foundation, not for children of privilege, but for souls long forgotten in the shadows of society, like she once was, young, alone, and voiceless. With the assets now rightfully and transparently recognized, Naomi announced the creation of the Edward Monroe Scholarship Fund, carrying the name of her late father, but also standing as a declaration that she did not reject her roots, rather used them as a foundation for something new. The announcement was not grand, held modestly in a small, warm hall. There was no red carpet, no press frenzy, only the emotional eyes of those who had always believed in her. Naomi stepped up to the podium, her voice not loud but clear and firm, each word carrying the weight of a heart that had weathered storms. "If I can turn pain into opportunity, then I hope these children will find their own place in this world." That sentence echoed not only through the hall, but quickly spread across media platforms, becoming a new rallying cry for a hopeful journey. Within hours, social networks were quoting her word for word. Major newspapers ran headlines filled with praise, treating it as a symbol of renewal. The media, once ruthless in probing Naomi's private life, now collectively praised her new path. They no longer wrote with curiosity, but with respect for someone who had overcome pain and used it to inspire others. Long-form pieces appeared on educational and social commentary platforms, describing her actions as a genuine effort to plant seeds for the future through the soil of the past. A photo of Naomi smiling gently, her hand resting on the shoulder of a group of students during the fund's first meeting, circulated widely, captioned, "She turned pain into hope." There were no more scenes of reporters crowding, no lenses hunting for tragedy. To the public now stood a composed Naomi, gentle but resilient, guided by heart rather than by prying eyes or shallow expectation. Scholarship applications began pouring in from everywhere. Impoverished families sent in forms, accompanied by trembling handwritten letters. Each letter was a life story, each story a fragment of memory Naomi had once lived herself. There was a boy who had lost his father at a young age, with a mother doing odd jobs, whose eyes lit up when he was informed of his acceptance. There was a girl mocked by classmates for her background, for her worn-out uniform and smudged notebooks, now with the chance to step into the art school she had only dared to admire through the gate. Naomi read every file, listened to every story as if she were were reliving her own childhood. The time when a hand extended at the right moment might be the only thing left to hold on to. Her heart could not stop trembling, as if to remind her that her journey was far from over. It had only changed form. The emotional scars she once carried had now become the driving force behind the path she was building for others to continue walking. Before long, the international community took notice of Naomi again, not because of the sensational lawsuit, but because of what she was quietly creating. Foreign news agencies reported on the scholarship fund as an example of how positive change can grow from personal tragedy. Education experts called it a turning point in compassion when one person chooses to rise above pain to open doors for others. On social media platforms, thousands shared that they admired Naomi not only for her resolve in court, but also for how she continued the story through actions rather than words. Naomi did not seek praise, yet it came to her in waves, like the tide hitting the shore. The phrase, "she turned pain into hope," appeared on banners at community events. Some schools even adopted it as a motto, posting it at entrances as a reminder to younger generations that education and opportunity can alter fate. Children who received scholarships sent thank you letters, their handwriting clumsy and uncertain. "I believe my future starts now." Naomi read each word, her eyes stinging, but a smile still played on her lips, knowing that a future was being written by those very hands. In another brief interview, when asked about her motivation for founding the fund, Naomi replied, "I lived under the weight of condescension long enough to understand that a hand extended at the right moment can change an entire life. If I can be that hand for someone, then that is the real legacy." Her simple answer struck a chord with millions. The interview clip spread rapidly, a vivid testament that kindness, when it comes from a real wound, can reach the deepest part of another person's soul. Gradually, the scholarship fund became more than a place to grant tuition. It became a support network. Vulnerable children, for the first time, felt they belonged, felt heard, felt valued. Naomi visited often, sitting down to talk with them like an older sister, someone who had been there before. She didn't tell her story to stir pity, but to inspire. That background does not define worth. That adversity cannot stop dreams. That image, Naomi sitting under a tree, talking with a group of children, her gentle smile and sincere gaze, was captured, shared, and etched into the public's memory as proof she had stepped onto a new path, no longer standing alone against prejudice, but walking alongside a new generation, giving them faith in the future. Meanwhile, in a completely opposite world, Gregory lived in the shadow of failure. Articles resurfaced dark scheme, images of him being dragged out of court, screaming madly at the cameras, all becoming stains that could never be erased. The name once associated with the luxury of the Monroe family was now tied to greed, selfishness, and hatred. Gregory sat alone in a massive mansion, now cold as a stone tomb. Lavish rooms had become nothing more than walls echoing his loneliness. He quietly read the news, skimmed through stories about Naomi, saw pictures of her holding the hand of a disabled child, smiling like a beam of light. Jealousy surged like a fever, suffocating and persistent. While society praised her as a new symbol, he had become a disgraceful memory, mocked and shunned. Gregory had tried many times to speak up, to salvage his reputation, but every attempt backfired. Every statement became a joke, every appearance shredded by mocking comments. The breaking point came when he happened to see the words, "She turned pain into hope," hanging in front of a local school. He smashed his wine glass in rage, but there was nothing more he could do except face himself. A man who once had everything, chose a cruel path, and lost it all. The bitterness seeped into every breath because Gregory understood Naomi had transcended all boundaries of wealth and fame. She hadn't just inherited assets, she had redefined legacy through compassion, something he would never reach. Naomi, on the other side, never once looked back. She kept smiling and moving forward, dedicating each day to new projects for the foundation. She visited schools, listened to the students' stories, encouraged them to dream, to keep going. She didn't need to prove anything to Gregory, to the media, or to anyone who once doubted her. She only needed to prove to the vulnerable children that dignity can never be taken away if one stands firm. The press continued to report on her, but now with genuine respect. Every time Naomi appeared with her calm smile, the public saw a clear message that the path she chose, quiet and unglamorous, was the one with the most enduring strength. At a small press conference, Naomi once said, "The most valuable thing isn't the legacy I receive, but the opportunity to give." That simple sentence moved the entire room. Without flowery words, she had shown the world that truth and kindness always carry more power than any cruel scheme. The day the verdict was delivered had long passed, and the cheers and public attention had gradually faded. Naomi chose to return to a quiet place. It was Edward Monroe's old house, a place filled with memories and the starting point of all the turmoil. The house still stood silently under the shade of ancient trees, its wooden window frames weathered by time, like a silent witness to generation. Naomi stepped slowly through the gate, her hand brushing against the moss-covered wall, the coolness seeping into her skin. So much had happened, yet this space remained solemn and unchanged, stirring something deep within her. The familiar living room opened with dim light filtering through the windows. On a small altar, a framed photo of Edward Monroe stood neatly, his gentle eyes gazing down. Naomi stood still for a few seconds, as if he were still there, calm and kind. She prepared a stick of incense, her hands trembling slightly from emotion. The flame lit, burned brightly for a moment, then settled into a glowing red line, releasing the gentle scent of agarwood throughout the room. Naomi placed the incense on the altar, pressed her palms together, bowed her head, and let a flood of unspoken emotions rise in her chest. In that moment, all the noise outside seemed to disappear. Naomi whispered, her voice shaky but clear, "You believed in me, and I won't let you down." The short sentence fell into the silence, echoing inside her like a vow. After all the trials and bitterness, she was now standing here, not as an outcast rejected by the family, but as the chosen one, the rightful heir not only to the estate, but to Edward Monroe's spiritual legacy. Naomi sat on the wooden chair beside the altar, her eyes following the curling trail of smoke. Memories came rushing back. She recalled the afternoons he taught her to read in the library, his voice slow and warm, reminding her that knowledge was the key to preserving one's dignity. She remembered when he placed a hand on her shoulder while others looked down on her, his eyes shining with faith that she would stand tall, that the path she chose, though difficult, would lead to the truth. Those images blended into the smoke, stinging Naomi's eyes. She understood then that Edward Monroe hadn't left her the inheritance out of pity, but because he believed in the inner strength she carried. He saw in Naomi someone who could continue the values he had spent his life upholding: justice and compassion. Naomi smiled through her tears and whispered again, "I'll use what you gave me to build what you dreamed of." The words rang out like a promise etched deep in her heart. Outside, the wind stirred gently, leaves rustling as if in reply. Naomi felt a sense of peace, as if he were there, listening and smiling in agreement. She stood and walked down the long hallway toward the house's library. The tall shelves were still filled, the scent of old paper mingling with aged wood to create a fragrance she'd never forget. Naomi ran her fingers along the spines of the books, feeling his presence in every page. This was the true treasure, the spiritual legacy Edward Monroe had left behind, and she knew it was her responsibility to preserve it and pass it on to future generations. Sitting at the familiar long table, Naomi opened one of his old notebooks. Inside were handwritten lines, sometimes messy, filled with thought. He wrote about justice, about the value of respecting human dignity, about the mistakes he had witnessed in society. Naomi read slowly, each word piercing straight into her heart. She saw clearly that the path she was on wasn't just an accidental continuation, but a choice he had somehow foreseen. The afternoon passed in silence. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm golden hue over the wooden table. Naomi closed the notebook, placing her hand on it as if to promise him she would preserve every thought, every value. She knew material wealth could fade with time, but this spiritual legacy was what would endure, spread, and live on in the hearts of those it inspired. As she left the house, Naomi paused on the front steps, turning back one last time. The sky was painted red by sunset, and the wooden frame glowed in the day's final light, as if bidding farewell. She smiled, filled with peace. Everything she had endured had now become the past, replaced by responsibility and conviction. The road ahead was still long, but Naomi knew she had a firm foundation, the promise she made to Edward Monroe, that she would never betray the faith he placed in her. That spiritual legacy now lived far beyond the old four walls, becoming the strength behind every step Naomi took. And in that moment, she understood she was not alone, for in every breath, in every decision, she could still hear that familiar voice echoing, "Stand tall, because the truth will always be yours." Naomi stood in front of the old house, the incense now faded, leaving only faint threads of smoke lingering in the air. She felt the weight on her shoulders dissolve, replaced by a deeper understanding of what truly remained after everything. The will had given her ownership, but the journey through humiliation, schemes, and the long fight had taught her that real value lay not in houses or bank accounts. Edward Monroe's legacy, now etched in Naomi's heart, was dignity and justice. He had not just left her tangible assets, but a reminder that truth and human worth were the most enduring forms of wealth, with power far beyond any check or plot of land. Thinking of that, Naomi suddenly felt a lightness in her chest. The days of ridicule, the prying eyes, the bitter laughter of Gregory and his allies, all seemed folded away into a box and sealed shut forever. No longer burdened by resentment, she now carried the responsibility of using her own experience to uphold spiritual value. She remembered Edward's gentle gaze, how he once told her that honor could not be bought with money, that true pride only came from living in truth. Those words, once overheard in childhood, had become the foundation of everything she now stood for. Sitting on the front steps, Naomi looked out at the garden. The grass had grown wild, and a few wildflowers stretched toward the late afternoon sun. In that scene, she suddenly felt that simplicity carried more power than all things glamorous. Wealth might spark conflict, but dignity helped people stand tall, even when crushed. Justice might arrive late, but when it did, it brought down every deceitful scheme in an instant. That was the legacy Edward had entrusted, and it was what Naomi now sought to preserve and pass on to those who came after. In the days that followed, Naomi devoted more time to community work. She spoke with children in the scholarship program, sharing her story not to draw sympathy, but to help them understand that contempt and oppression do not define human worth. In each attentive gaze, she glimpsed her former self, a girl surrounded by prejudice, quietly nurturing a dream. Now, she had become living proof that if one holds on to dignity, justice will eventually come. The media might praise her, the public might support her, but Naomi understood best that the real change lay within her own heart. From the quiet girl humiliated during the will reading, she now walked with her head held high. The bitter whirlwind, from mocking laughter to the courtroom verdicts, had come full circle. She had begun in pain, weathered the storm, and arrived at peace, knowing that a true legacy wasn't built on wealth, but on belief in human dignity. On the day she left the house, Naomi looked back one last time. The home no longer felt like just the residence of someone long gone, but a symbol of the journey toward justice. In the deep red glow of sunset, the wooden frame gleamed, as if affirming that the past was complete, the present was unfolding, and the future was hers to write. Naomi smiled, her eyes shining with light, whispering to herself, "A circle has closed." That feeling wasn't pride, but peace. She no longer had to prove anything, nor seek revenge. Truth and justice had done that for her. For the rest of her life, Naomi wanted to nurture that belief, to show others like her that there was another path, a path not paved with riches, but with resilience and kindness. And so, Naomi Ellis's story closed not with cheers or applause, but with a quiet, powerful stillness. It began with a will reading where she was publicly shamed, and ended with her being recognized not only as the heir to an estate, but as the keeper of a moral legacy. The cycle of truth had run its course, and in that moment, Naomi stepped into a new chapter, where she was no longer a victim of the past, but a symbol of dignity and justice, living proof that in the end, the truth is what remains. The story of Naomi Ellis came to a close, but its resonance continued to ripple through the community. People began to reflect on everything that had unfolded, from the moment a young woman was humiliated in a will-reading room to the final declaration of justice in court. What made many pause was not the value of the inheritance Naomi received, but the striking truth that justice can sometimes arrive through an unexpected decision. A notarized will and the trust Edward Monroe placed in his granddaughter were enough to overturn forces that once seemed untouchable. That very surprise became proof fairness doesn't always follow the usual path. Sometimes it lies hidden in choices that appear small but have the power to shake an entire system. As the public looked back, it became clear that arrogance and abuse of power had led to the downfall of Gregory, Kane, and Doyle. Their actions, from mockery and humiliation to orchestrating Naomi's disgrace, revealed the true face of a class used to wielding power to suppress others. Once exposed, that truth no longer belonged solely to a legal dispute, but expanded into a broader warning. It forced society to confront how power is misused and made people wonder how many other Naomis were silently enduring similar injustice. Discussions erupted across forums, from schools to legislative halls. Debates focused on reforming legal system, proposing stricter oversight to prevent police interference in matters beyond their jurisdiction. The media kept analyzing the case, pointing out that without the leaked recording or the tightly notarized will, Naomi might have become just another silent victim of a ruthless setup. This lesson, therefore, extended beyond the Monroe family. It called on society as a whole to better protect the vulnerable from abuse. Social organizations quickly adopted Naomi's story as the foundation for awareness campaigns. They emphasized that every seemingly small choice, every act of standing with the truth, can create change. From Naomi's experience, people learned that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It comes when someone is steadfast enough to see it through. and when a community is clear-eyed enough to listen. That momentum spread, inspiring many to speak out about the injustices they had faced, believing their voices could change outcomes. Naomi no longer needed to appear in public to prove anything, yet her name continued to be mentioned in classrooms, on television, and in community discussions. She became a symbol of how one individual could shake a system rooted in abuse. And it was her calm, humble presence, after everything, that made society believe the real lesson wasn't just in her victory, but in her ability to turn pain into action and truth into collective belief. Change didn't happen overnight, but step by step, the legal system began to review its procedures. The media started placing greater emphasis on accountability, and the public grew more aware of oppressive behavior. The lesson from Naomi became a guiding light for many young people, that dignity cannot be bought with money, and justice can sometimes be unlocked through simple, yet courageous decisions. A cycle came to a close, leaving behind not the echo of revenge, but of renewal. Naomi Ellis was no longer merely the heir to a fortune, but the one who passed on a moral legacy to society. Truth must be spoken, abuse of power must be exposed, and justice, even when delayed, can still transform an entire community. When people recall her story, they don't remember the numbers attached to the estate, but the image of a girl calmly facing the storm and walking out with light in her eyes. And the lesson for society still echoes. Justice is not a privilege, it is a right for all, and once the truth is revealed, it will force every abuser of power to bow their heads. After days of being hailed as a symbol, Naomi gradually returned to everyday life, yet her image remained vivid in people's minds. They saw in her not just the tale of a sensational inheritance, proof dignity matters more than background. From a girl mocked for her origin, Naomi walked a thorny path to prove that a person's worth lies not in their surname or family status, but in their resolve and self-respect. That alone shifted public perception and led many to believe, perhaps for the first time, that one's origin is not a sentence, but the starting point for a journey each individual chooses. Instead of focusing only on the wealth Naomi inherited, newspapers began highlighting the message she left behind. They wrote that Naomi Ellis proved a simple truth, often forgotten, that people are not defined by wealth or poverty, nor boxed in by race or circumstances, but recognized by the dignity they uphold through trial. Analytical pieces stressed that if it weren't for Naomi's steady gaze, if not for the weight of her silence in the moments she was insulted, this story might have ended as just another inheritance dispute. It was Naomi's integrity that turned it into a larger lesson. In schools, teachers used Naomi as an example when teaching fairness and respect. They told students about a girl who was once dismissed by an entire room, yet through her persistence, changed the way society viewed her. Community meetings spoke of her too, presenting Naomi as a role model to inspire young people to believe in themselves and reject anyone's imposed definition of worth. When asked about their dreams, many children said they wanted to be as strong as Naomi, to live true to their dignity no matter what others think. At an international conference, Naomi once said simply, "No one has the right to define your worth." The words echoed through the hall, followed by a brief silence before the entire room rose in applause. That sentence was quoted in global newspapers, printed on banners at human rights events, and spread like a living slogan. People found in that statement not just personal affirmation, but a societal reminder that all forms of discrimination and humiliation cannot erase the truth of human dignity. When she returned from that trip, Naomi saw her words displayed on large digital billboards, accompanied by an image of her sitting calmly in the courtroom that day. She didn't feel pride, only smiled quietly. For Naomi, her actions were never about seeking praise, but about leaving behind a message that everyone has the right to walk with belief in their own value. Public recognition was merely an added reward. The real victory was that those once looked down upon could now lift their heads and believe they were never lesser. The story closes with the journey Naomi walked, from a girl shamed during a will reading to a global symbol of dignity. Every step she took proved that truth may be hidden temporarily, but dignity never disappears. And that became a shared message. No one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, has the right to define another person's value, because that worth lies in how they live, in the pride they hold onto when the world turns its back. Naomi Ellis, with her well-timed silence and the light in her eyes amid a storm of judgment, left behind a legacy greater than any inheritance. The belief that justice and dignity will always prevail. And when society reflects on her story, what lingers isn't the numbers in the will, but a simple reminder that rings like a bell. No one has the right to define your worth. The story of Naomi Ellis closes with an image both simple and powerful. A young woman, once crushed by prejudice, walking out of Edward Monroe's old house with the belief that true inheritance lies not in material wealth, but in the fairness and dignity that people preserve. From the moment she was mocked during the reading of the will to the time she sat silently in a public trial, Naomi endured a bitter journey, facing arrogance, abuse of power, and schemes meant solely to diminish her. But from those very days, she found an inner strength to stand tall and wait for the truth to reveal itself. What people remember isn't the value of the estate Naomi inherited, but how she turned pain into belief, contempt into an opportunity to affirm her worth. Gregory, Kane, and Doyle once stood with false power, but in the end, they were nothing more than failures before the light of justice. When the public witnessed the verdict, when they saw those who once reveled in Naomi's humiliation dragged out in disgrace, everyone understood that justice may arrive late, but it is never absent. And it was Naomi's patience that made that victory possible. As the story spread beyond the courtroom, the public didn't see Naomi as a lucky heiress, but as a symbol. Images of her sitting upright, her calm yet resolute gaze amid a wave of ridicule, became proof of the power of silence at the right moment. People began comparing her journey to that of historical figures who had faced injustice, and they realized that what makes someone remembered isn't the wealth they hold, but the dignity they protect. Naomi proved that an ordinary person can change how society sees things simply by staying true to the truth. But Naomi's journey didn't end there. What made her story resonate even further was how she chose to use her victory. Instead of enjoying the inheritance as a personal reward, Naomi used it to establish a scholarship fund, giving opportunities to children who had been forgotten. That action showed that a true legacy doesn't lie in keeping things for oneself, but in spreading hope to others. When the public saw Naomi talking with underprivileged children, placing a hand on their shoulders and affirming that opportunity can change a life, they understood she wasn't just the winner of a lawsuit, but someone actively shaping a spiritual legacy for the next generation. Gregory, in bitterness, realized that greed and scheming had made him the loser. Though born into a wealthy family, he couldn't hold on to society's respect, because dignity can never be bought. In contrast, Naomi, with a modest background and once looked down upon, became a respected role model. That contrast gave the story profound humanity. A person's worth isn't measured by their origin, but by how they face adversity. From Naomi Ellis's story, society learned many lessons. People understood that justice can begin from something seemingly small, like Edward Monroe's will, but its power lies in someone's courage to stand up and keep believing. They also realized that once the truth is exposed, it will force those who abuse power to bow their heads. The social conversations that followed weren't just about Naomi, but expanded into discussions on oversight, transparency, and the responsibility of those in positions of power. Naomi proved that dignity matters more than background. She became the living example of the phrase, "No one has the right to define your worth." When the public recalls this story, they don't remember the lavish parties under glowing chandeliers or the heavy insults, but the image of a small girl, head held high, walking out of the storm with unshakable belief. It's a timeless lesson, a reminder that in every situation, the one thing that must never be lost is self-respect. From this story, everyone can find a lesson of their own. For those who have ever been looked down on, Naomi is proof patience and persistence can lead them into the light. For those who have ever held power, her story serves as a reminder that if they use it to trample others, the truth will one day demand a reckoning. And for society as a whole, Naomi Ellis becomes a symbol. Fairness is not a privilege, but a right for everyone. Looking back, the story of Naomi Ellis is not merely an account of an inheritance case, but an epic of human dignity. It affirms that an individual, no matter their background, can influence an entire community's perspective. It reminds us that while truth may be hidden in the dark, light will always find a way. And it proves that true victory is not in gaining wealth, but in turning that victory into hope for others. For Naomi, that cycle has come full circle. She began in humiliation, weathered the storm, and ended with a legacy of values far beyond material worth. And because of that, this story has become a source of inspiration not just for those who knew Naomi, but for anyone searching for faith to overcome hardship. Because in the end, the final message still echoes. No one has the right to define your worth. This is the simple yet powerful message that closes Naomi Ellis's story, leaving a lasting impact on society and on every heart followed her journey.